Chapter 46. Cornered. A.N. Petter Baelish has not been having a good time. XXX. What are we going to do, Petter? What if they find out about everything you've done? What if they find out about us? Sitting in his quarters, Petter Baelish sighs as he feels the pain between his eyes building. Pacing back and forth across the room in front of him is none other than Lisa Aron, and at this rate the woman might just wind up wearing a rut into the floor with how long she's been at it. He's definitely regretting telling her everything that he's been dealing with now, but at the time Petter had needed an outlet for all of the bullshit. Unfortunately, the outlet that he picked was the highly neurotic, mentally unstable wife of the man that he's been cuckolding for more than a decade. It's not the kind of mistake Petter would have made under normal circumstances, but recent times have been far from normal. Even as Lisa is having a quite loud, external freakout in the middle of his quarters, Petter has to admit that he's busy freaking out internally, considering just how fucked it's all become and what he's going to do next. And the worst part is that his enemies still don't even know that they're ruining him. The king and his hand and the rest of his small council, they still have no clue that Petter has had his fingers in every single pie they've been cracking down on since Renly's war ended. It had started with Lord Seaworth, of course. The new master of ships was far more down-to-earth and self-aware than Stannis had been. And that made it all the harder to get anything past the man. When Stannis was master of ships, one could always count on there to be both sailors and captains who were willing to take on an extra bit of work on the side for some extra coin. Not to mention plenty of people at the docks all up and down the coast who were happy to turn a blind eye for the right bribe. See, that was the thing about people. People were greedy and self-serving, and trying to stop them from being greedy and self-serving with as blunt and heavy-handed tactics as the Baratheon lord used was a lesson in futility. Stannis had always gone that heavy-handed route, but it didn't stop them or convince them to change their ways, it merely made them sneakier. Someone like Stannis Baratheon couldn't possibly fathom the minds of the thugs, ne'er-do-wells, and criminals who made up the sorts of people that Petter had been tapped into. But someone like Davos Seaworth, who had spent much of his life as a smuggler and only found his calling towards justice and righteousness later on, that was different. But Petter was smart enough to have seen that coming. He'd made sure to divest himself of volatile assets that he was certain Davos would be going after. In the end, while he hadn't been made completely whole, his losses had been negligible at best. At least at first anyways. That was only the start though. A premonition of what was to come. Because between Stannis and Jon, nothing was safe anymore. Nothing was sacred. Stannis was far more suited for being master of laws than he had been master of ships, and he'd been proving it in a number of ways, including a steady string of men who had been sent to either the block or the wall. Men who Petter had found very useful. Men who he'd had to burn every connection with so that their actions couldn't be traced back to him. The only saving grace, at least where the new master of laws was concerned, was that Stannis had to split his time between King's Landing and the Stormlands rather equally. He'd done his duties admirably enough so far, but ultimately the amount of work he had on his plate left him unable to focus on the true problem, Petter himself. That would have been great for Petter's purposes, but then there was Jon. Jon Arryn, Hand of the King, was finally acting like a proper administrator of both the realm and the capital. It was just too bad that it was at the expense of everything Petter had been building for more than a decade now. And of course, Axel wasn't causing nearly as many fires for Jon as Robert had. Even with Sansa Stark and Arianne Martell both in the city vying for the young king's attention and time, Axel required far less maintenance than his father ever had. Petter had even considered making a mess of things regarding the search for a queen. Such as poisoning Sansa Stark and pinning it on the Dornish princess to provide a crisis for Jon to get bogged down in. Unfortunately, there were two major problems with that plan. First, there was the fact that Sansa Stark was Catelyn's daughter and she had all of her mother's beauty from when Catelyn was younger. Petter was loath to kill such a beautiful young woman if he was being honest. But secondly, and much more importantly, they doubled the taste testers in the Red Keep ahead of either prospective queen's arrival. Petter hadn't thought much of that precaution at the time, but all of a sudden it was all but impossible to arrange a surprise illness, or accident, even if he wanted to. No, poisoning anyone staying in the Red Keep was an exercise in futility at the moment, unfortunately. Meanwhile, Jon had wanted all of their records audited, reorganized, and checked over because the Hand had found discrepancies in the Crown's debts to various lenders. These discrepancies were all Petter's fault of course, but fortunately he had one good stroke of luck going for him. Namely, Jon Arryn couldn't fathom that Petter would betray him. The old man was so blinded by his own sense of honor that he truly didn't think Petter was capable of even the slightest hint of treachery. That was, quite frankly, the only reason Petter had survived until this point. But the situation was growing more and more desperate by the day, hence his unloading upon Lisa in the hopes of dealing with some of his stress. Especially when some idiot on his payroll had not only made the mistake of trying to shake down an Ironborn ship captained by the daughter of Balon Greyjoy for protection fees, but he'd then gone on to send some men to try and kill her or extract the gold from her person in some other heinous way. Petter wouldn't have cared that much if Asha Greyjoy had actually died or been disappeared, to be fair, but obviously that hadn't fucking happened. Instead, she had killed her assailants and done so with the help of the king of all people at the same time. And seeing as the original man had been trying to collect those fees in the name of the Master of Coin, Petter had to act very fast and very carefully. Blaming it all on one of the only Goldcloak captains who had managed to fly under the radar of Jon and Stannis reforms regarding the City Watch had been a move made in desperation. One that had in turn burned one of Petter's last capable contacts within the City Watch, leaving him without any eyes and ears in the Goldcloaks whatsoever at this point. He hadn't had the chance to rectify that matter in the slightest just yet either, because the imminent arrival of a representative from the Iron Bank had taken up all of his time. Petter had been forced to work tirelessly day and night from the moment that he'd been informed of the Iron Bank's arrival, making sure everything was in order. Because the thing was, it hadn't been in order. It hadn't even slightly been in order when Petter first found out that a representative of the Iron Bank was on his way. Finding a way to balance things and make it so that the numbers did in fact line up between the Crown's records and the Iron Bank's records had truly stretched Petter's skills to their utmost limits, but he'd done it in the end. He'd gotten the number on the Crown's books within 11 golden dragons of the number that the Iron Bank representative brought with him. That was good because it had earned him quite a lot of goodwill with Jon, and at this point Petter needed that if he was going to make something of this mess. He needed Jon to continue inadvertently shielding him from all of the others, including the king, until Petter could finally figure out what he was going to do next. And he needed to decide what that was going to be before Stannis finished settling his affairs in the Stormlands and was able to focus all of his attention on his duties in King's Landing. Petter. What are we going to do? Shaken from his thoughts, Petter blinks as he realizes that Lisa is still in his quarters, still frantically pacing back and forth, and still having a panic attack. Yes, telling her anything important about what was happening had been a monumental mistake, but given how sleep-deprived, stressed, and overburdened he currently was, he would forgive himself all the same. Then again, the longer he stares at her, the more he realizes that Lisa might just be the answer to all of his problems. So what if the noose was slowly shrinking around his neck here in King's Landing? He just had to slip that noose and go somewhere else. Opportunities and costs. It was all just opportunities and costs. Smiling with more feeling than he had in weeks, Petter chuckles and shakes his head at Lisa's worried look. Don't fret, my dear Lisa. There's no need to worry. I know exactly what we're going to do. Lisa blinks in surprise, clearly caught off guard. But then to be fair, Petter had just spent over an hour tersely detailing all of his struggles and woes to the woman. It was no surprise that she's confused by the sudden change in his mood. At the same time, he'd spent most of their respective lives cultivating a certain image with the less attractive of the Tully sisters. Lisa believes in him in a way that nobody, certainly not Catelyn Stark, ever had. He'd tried to reach out to Catelyn once since she'd arrived in the city, hoping to catch up with her and chat. But the North and childbirth hadn't been kind to the woman he'd once risked it all for. Not only was Catelyn not nearly as attractive as she once was, but her personality had also become far more rotten than Petter remembered. And if he had to deal with an unattractive and altogether rotten Tully sister, he might as well stick to the one who he had completely wrapped around his finger. Case in point, Lisa's surprise melts away in mere moments, her eyes filled with absolute trust and devotion as she looks at him excitedly. I'm so glad, Petter. I knew you would have a way out of this mess. What do you need of me? You know that I will always be on your side. I'm willing to do anything you ask of me. Indeed, he knows that very well. He also knows that Lisa is, barely competent at best and not to be trusted with anything too difficult. Still. You're finally getting your wish, my love. It's time for Jon Arryn to die. Lisa's eyes widen and she gasps in excitement, as though her name day has come early. Before he can continue on, she's already crossed the room and seized upon his face with both hands, kissing him deeply and passionately. Petter plays along, of course, even as the woman climbs into his lap. Eventually though, she does pull back, beaming at him as she drapes her arms around his neck. Truly. How shall we do it? Poison. I could deliver it to him for you, no one would know, especially not my lord husband. If not for the doubling of taste testers and the added security around the Red Keep, that very much would be how Petter would have gone about this. He'd prepared Lisa for the role of her husband's killer for years, after all. But, no. No, he knew he couldn't rely on Lisa to deal with her husband now. He needed competence. He needed to make sure that everything would go off without a hitch. Therefore, Lisa could not be involved. Of course, when he tells her that, he words it differently. I have something better in mind. Something you won't have to dirty your hands for, sweetheart. Lisa pouts at him in what she probably considers a cutesy manner. Ah, but I want to. For you, my love. Forcing a chuckle even as he's cringing internally, Petter shakes his head. I know, darling. I know. But the plan I have in mind will require us both to keep our hands clean. All I need you to do is be ready to leave the city when I tell you to. You, me, and your darling son will be leaving King's Landing and going to the Vale together. Doesn't that sound lovely? Lisa nods her head along obediently. It does. It sounds wonderful. But, won't the king suspect us if my husband dies as we flee the city? Petter just grins, and this time he doesn't have to force it. You let me worry about that, Lisa. I want you to go and begin making preparations now, but be subtle about things. It will probably still be some weeks before we're ready to depart, alright? Don't let them know anything is amiss until the time comes. Reluctantly, Lisa climbs out of his lap and slowly nods. I understand, Petter. It will be as you say, do not worry. I'll make sure my sweet Robin is ready to leave the moment that you give the word. With that, she departs from his quarters and Petter has blessed quiet at long last. He basks in it for a moment, his eyes drifting shut as he lets out a sigh. Then, they snap open again and he turns to his desk, moving and grabbing a piece of parchment. He was going to need to move some things up a bit if this plan he'd just thought up was going to work. Originally, he and Euron Greyjoy had both agreed to wait a little bit longer before making any moves, but given just how desperate things were getting for him here in King's Landing, Petter couldn't afford to wait any longer. Euron Greyjoy was just going to have to be ready to take advantage of the chaos that Petter was planning on causing. And if he wasn't, well then, that was the Ironborn's own fault. Petter would give him ample warning, and it would be up to Euron to capitalize on it or not. XXX. And so Petter finally decides that Jon Arryn has to die. But how will he do it? What is he planning? Chapter 47, Manipulation. Axel has the very best schemes. XXX. You called for us, your grace. Axel turns to regard Nymeria and Obara Sand with a smile as they step out into the courtyard. He sees how they both stiffen upon seeing the other two individuals waiting alongside him though. No doubt neither of them much cares about the presence of Brienne of Tarth, but both sand snakes react rather negatively when they see that the member of the Kingsguard currently accompanying him is none other than Esser Sandor Clegane. Even after months as a knight of his Kingsguard, the Hound still doesn't look very comfortable in his white cloak and shining armor. In fact, the only time the young king would say that Sandor looks happy or content is in the moments when they're sparring and the man is reaching beyond his limits, advancing his skill with the blade against the immovable wall that is Axel Baratheon. But Axel had warned the man. He'd given Sandor ample time to leave King's Landing, or at least the Red Keep, and avoid being sworn into his service. In the end, Sandor had remained for too long and Axel had made him one of his Kingsguard, filling that last empty slot in the process. Of course, there were those currently staying in the Red Keep who had a problem with that, given Sandor's house name. Two of them were now standing in the courtyard across from him now. None of the Dornish party had tried to do anything untoward to the Hound just yet, but all the same. I did. It's good that you're here. Now that you are, we can finally begin. Obara narrows her eyes, while Nymeria, the more cunning of the two, continues to smile, speaking for both of them. I'm afraid I don't understand. Begin what, your grace? Rather than answer with words, he does so with actions by walking over to the nearby rack. Pulling Stoneheart, still sheathed, from his side, Axel sets it down and picks up a blunted steel sword. Then, he turns to regard all four individuals standing in the courtyard facing him. A test of sorts. You four are some of the best fights I've had in recent months. And yet, I find myself unchallenged, even against all of you. There's some bristling and scowling at that, though none of them can gainsay him. Axel just grins brightly, pretending like he didn't intend any insult. It was nice to have something of an affable reputation. People tended to underestimate him because he'd come from a bastard's background. So I thought to myself, how to rectify the situation. And then I realized, of course. I'll just have all four of you attack me together. A knight of the Kingsguard, a woman who might as well be a knight, a mid-ranged spear fighter, and a ranged knife thrower. You four complement each other perfectly and are therefore the best group for such a task. Axel is, of course, lying through his teeth here. While Sandor was probably one of the better fights he could count on these days, and Brienne wasn't too bad herself, the truth was, neither Obara nor Nymeria were quite as good as they thought themselves to be. And really, if he was trying to form up a group of the most capable warriors currently in King's Landing, he probably would have invited Asha as well. He just had to hope she wouldn't find out about all of this and feel snubbed, but given what he was really intending with all of this, her presence would really only complicate matters. Nymeria Sand wasn't a warrior to begin with, in all fairness. She was an excellent hand with her hidden blades, don't get him wrong. However, with a slender, slim figure and not much in the way of muscle, she had to rely on keeping her distance from her opponents. They'd only sparred a handful of times compared to him and Obara, but each time Nymeria hadn't been able to touch him with a single knife throw. This was something Axel knew vexed her to no end, even if she made a good show of hiding it. Obara Sand on the other hand, now she was a warrior. Or at least, she considered herself a warrior. She preferred spear and whip instead of sword, which made sense given that she was a woman and therefore physically weaker than most men. And seeing how she didn't have Brienne's height or reach to make up for that simple truth, she had to improvise. And yet, for all that she styled herself as a warrior, Axel fully believed that any man on his Kingsguard, except for Trant perhaps, could easily equal or best her in battle, so long as there was no poison involved. She really wasn't as good as she thought she was, though her pride wouldn't allow her to accept that fact. So then why was Axel doing this? Simple really. It had been several weeks since he'd started betting both Sansa Stark and Arianne Martell, along with their seconds, Marjorie and Tyene. Sansa still insisted on keeping her maidenhead intact, something Axel had no problem with because they'd done pretty much everything else together and Marjorie was always there to pick up the slack. Meanwhile, Arianne insisted on trying to challenge his stamina every chance she could. Usually this resulted in both her and Tyene needing days to recover afterwards because Axel would unquestionably run them ragged and leave them sore as can be. Unfortunately, while they were all having a lot more fun together, this had nevertheless prompted even more of a competitive spirit between the two women that Axel was considering for the position of queen. And there wasn't much he could do about that competition, nor much he wanted to do either considering he liked how competitive they were both being. But while he might not be able to fix that mess, he could definitely do something about the undercurrent of hatred being directed at one of his Kingsguard just because the man shared a name with a monster. Hence Axel had come up with a superb plan that involved getting the more rambunctious of the three sand snakes in King's Landing to finally lay off of Sandor. He can see immediately that all four buy his bullshit about being the best fights he's had, hook, line, and sinker. Obara in particular looks pleased as she puffs out her chest. However, it doesn't stop her from shooting a glare at Sandor all the same, her eyes narrowing with hatred at the hound. Nymeria is a bit more diplomatic. You wish for us all to fight together, Your Grace. I'm not entirely sure that's the best idea. Obara and I might be practiced at fighting alongside one another, but we have no experience with these two. Axel just smirks and lifts up his blunted sword. Sometimes it was good to have a reputation as a bit of a single-minded king. Try. Or feel free to admit defeat if you like. The outcome will honestly be the same either way, but the respect I feel for each of you will certainly change depending on your decisions. That gets them all, Axel notes. He grins as their animosity for one another swiftly shifts to him just as intended. Obara and Nymeria might hate Clegane for his brother's actions, but that's a distant, second-hand sort of hatred. However, their irritation over getting their asses handed to them in every single spar they've had with Axel, that's much closer to home. Far more recent too. Soon enough, he's facing off across all four of them with their weapons drawn. They stand apart from one another, with only Nymeria and Obara really close to each other. Nymeria stands behind Obara, while Obara wields shield and spear at the ready. For a moment, everything is still. And then, the three in the front launch themselves forward. Brienne and Sandor have at least gotten better at fighting side by side against him over the months since he began sparring with them. Obara, meanwhile, simply takes the side of him that they're not on, her spear trying to probe his defenses as they start to harry him. And finally, Nymeria is on the wings, her hidden blades flashing out into her hands as she narrows her eyes and waits for an opening. Axel gives her a few, of course, only to knock her blades out of the air or dodge them effortlessly. In fact, he deals with all four of them rather effortlessly. Showing off just a bit more speed and a bit more strength than usual, Axel proceeds to dismantle the four fighters piece by piece. He puts Brienne on her ass, slams Sandor down to a knee, and knocks Obara's spear from what should have been an ironclad grasp, forcing her to scramble for it. All while deflecting or sidestepping Nymeria's blades at the same time. They're not bad, to be fair. But they aren't him. Nobody is him. And at this point, Axel is beginning to think he might never actually get the challenge he's started to crave. But at least for today, that's not what he's after anyways. He didn't summon them all together because they were the best of the best, like he'd claimed. No, he summoned them here to put the Sand Snake's issues to bed in the only way he knows how. The fighting continues for a good 15 minutes before everyone except for Axel has to take a break, panting and breathing heavily and staring at him with dark eyes as they try to catch their breath while watching him cautiously. Axel just smirks, pacing back and forth in front of all of them. Even Nymeria has overexerted herself at this point, though to no avail. Every throw has been a failure. Pathetic. His proclamation rings out through the courtyard, prompting all of them to stiffen in response. Axel just smiles at their expressions. You'd have a better shot against me if you fought together, but instead you insist on splitting up. He looks to Sandor and Brienne. Even now after all this time, you barely show any teamwork with one another, despite knowing that neither of you has a chance against me alone. As they stew in that, he then looks to Nymeria and Obara. And you two, you fight well enough together, but you ignore the two knights who could easily strengthen your fighting styles and give you far more openings than you currently have against me. You use them, but you don't work with them. Nymeria grimaces, but it's Obara who snarls, breaking the silence. There's a reason that of the two Sand Snakes, Nymeria is the one who does most of the talking. Obara is not nearly as well-mannered. You expect us to work with him. A Clegane. After what his brother did to our aunt and her children. With a snarl, Obara spits on the ground. I'd rather lose 1,000 battles than rely on his sword arm. This was why Axel had made sure it was just the 5 of them, even picking a lesser-used courtyard instead of the normal training yard. He'd been expecting an outburst like this one, counting on it, even. Everything so far had been building towards this moment. Even as Sandor stiffens in place, Axel is shaking his head. You know nothing, Obara Sand. Her eyes narrow in anger, only for Nymeria to place a soothing hand on her arm to keep her quiet. The more diplomatic of the two Sand Snakes offers Axel a smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. Apologies, Your Grace. My sister's temper got the better of her. Please forgive her. Axel crosses his arms over his chest and shakes his head. I care little for her temper. I refuse to let this fester any longer. Tell me, did you know that Clegane here didn't really want to become my Kingsguard? He didn't even want to be knighted either. In the end, knowing full well his discomfort, I made him an offer. He could ask any one thing of me, a single boon in exchange for joining my Kingsguard. Do you know what he chose? Nymeria's smile looks strained at this point. Obara just looks angry as ever. It's obvious neither of them really cares. But they can't say that because Axel is the king of the 7 kingdoms. So instead, Nymeria continues to be diplomatic. No, Your Grace. Glancing over at Sandor, Axel can tell that he's angry too, mostly at Axel for airing his dirty laundry. But that was the privilege of a king, at the end of the day. The boon he asked for in exchange for joining my Kingsguard was simple. He asked me to take Gregor Clegane's head for him. The admission lands like a massive boulder in a small pond. Nymeria and Obara's eyes widen in shock and stupefaction. Axel just smiles all the wider. I've heard the terrible things that Gregor Clegane has gotten up to. I know his crimes, I know he is unworthy of being a knight of the 7 kingdoms. It's a rather easy request to grant in the end. When the opportunity next presents itself, I have sworn to relieve the mountain that rides of his head myself. Silence fills the courtyard. Axel isn't too worried about Brienne being here for this. She has her own sort of honor, after all, and she knows what sorts of things the mountain has done just like anyone else. Meanwhile, it's obvious that neither of the Sand Snakes know what to say. So Axel decides to really drive the point home, even if it has to be at Sandor's expense, unfortunately. Sir Clegane. Remove your helmet. There's a pause and it's obvious that Sandor is considering refusing the order, but finally, the Kingsguard reaches up and pulls off his helmet, revealing his burned face. It's no secret what he looks like, to be fair. Long before he took up the white cloak, he went everywhere with his facial scars on display. But as Nymeria and Obara gaze upon Sandor's burns, Axel can tell that the Dornish women are truly seeing them for the first time, and realizing where they came from. He doesn't have to say anything more, doesn't have to explain the entire sordid ordeal that was Sandor's rotten childhood. They're at least smart enough to catch a hint and comprehend the lesson here. Tossing his blunted sword aside, Axel retrieves Stoneheart from the rack and places it back on his waist. Then, he looks to the four of them, all still silent and unmoving. If you four learn to fight together as well as you fight solo, then you might actually be enough to give me a challenge. Consider this an order from your king, you are to train with one another at least 3 times a week. We will continue testing your skills each fortnight. I hope you manage not to disappoint. And then he leaves, walking away just like that. But then, to be fair, he's the king. He can do that sort of thing, even if he definitely plans to make this up to Sandor later. Or at least, that's the thought running through Axel's mind right up until he enters the nearest corridor just to find Jon Arryn waiting for him. Immediately, Axel grimaces as his loyal hand falls into step beside him. That was, interestingly done, Axel. I only hope it doesn't blow up in your face. Snorting in amusement, Axel shakes his head. If it does, I'm more than durable enough to survive it. How are things, Jon? Letting out a weary sigh, his hand runs fingers through his gray hair. Things are moving along apace, my king. The audit is almost finished. We weed out more and more of the corruption I let fester during your father's reign by the day. Axel stops and turns towards Jon to scowl, cutting the older man off with nothing but a look before he can get too down on himself. Do not blame yourself, Jon. Not for my father's excesses. You tried to warn him. You tried to rein him in. But he was still king. His choices were his own. If he'd only listened to you half as much as he should have, maybe we wouldn't be in this damn mess. Jon smiles wanly, inclining his head. I appreciate your kind words, Axel, but some of the blame must fall on me anyways. Robert's whoring, feasting, and reveling were one thing. But the corruption, he had little part in that. At worst, he was a distraction that allowed all of the rats to scurry around our feet unnoticed. Still, I should have looked down at least once and recognized what we were dealing with. Axel frowns, still not pleased with Jon's self-deprecation. But before he can defend the man against his own words further, Jon is the one who now pins Axel with a look. Still, if you mean what you say, perhaps you will let this old man give you some advice. And maybe, if the 7 are very kind, you'll even listen to it. Wincing, Axel already knows what Jon is going to tell him. He can feel it in the pit of his stomach, even as he gestures for the older man to speak. Jon hesitates for just a moment before grunting. You must make a choice, Axel. You must marry one of the 2 women who have been all but courting you for months now. The rumors in both the Red Keep and King's Landing abound. It won't be long before they reach the rest of the 7 kingdoms as well if they haven't already. You need a queen. You need children of your loins. You need to choose. It's the last thing that Axel wants to hear. But perhaps that's why he needs to hear it. Grimacing, Axel hangs his head for a moment, before finally nodding. You're right, Jon. I've been indecisive for long enough. The Lady Stark and Princess Martell have both made it clear that they want to be my queen. All that's left is for me to pick one, but I've refused for fear of hurting the other. And yet, by doing so, I'm hurting them both in a way, aren't I? And I'm hurting the realm too. Jon's hand comes down on Axel's shoulder, giving it a solemn squeeze. Well said, Axel. Well said. It seems you already know what you must do. Axel nods, having to swallow the lump in his throat briefly before letting out a shuddering breath. Yes. Call for a small council meeting, first thing tomorrow morning. I will announce my decision there first and then go speak with both women afterwards. His hand inclines his head. Understood. We will not have full attendance, I imagine. Stannis is currently away at Storm's End continuing to get his house in order, and Davos left for an inspection on Dragonstone just yesterday. But everyone else shall be there, I'll make sure of it. Grunting, Axel just nods again. Very well. I shall see you then. As Jon walks away, Axel watches him go for a moment before turning and striding in the opposite direction. He doesn't go to either of his prospective brides. He doesn't go to anyone, really. Instead, he seeks solitude. Why? Because even though he just told Jon that he would pick a queen on the morrow, he honestly still has no idea just who he's going to marry. XXX. Poor Axel. Forced to make a choice. But who? Who will he choose? Maybe he'll finally realize he shouldn't have to make a choice. Chapter 48. Choices. A.N. Varys Pov as Axel finally announces just who his queen will be. XXX. Where in the seven hells are Petter and Pycelle? They're both late. Lord Aaron's irritation receives no response from the other three men in the small council chambers. The king sits quietly at the head of the table, looking uncharacteristically dour and morose. Varys, meanwhile, simply smiles placidly with his hands folded in the arms of his robes. And of course, Esser Aris Oakhart, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, stands silently and at the ready near the door just like always. Admittedly, it is a rather sorry showing for the small council today. Lord Stannis is off at Storm's End still getting his new lands in order, as he'd been on and off again for months now. Meanwhile, Lord Davos is off on a voyage to Dragonstone. That just leaves Lord Baelish, Grandmaster Pycelle, Lord Arryn, Lord Commander Oakhart, and Varys himself. And the king too of course, who Varys has it on good authority will be announcing his choice for queen this fine morning. It's obvious from the dark look on Axel Baratheon's face that he didn't sleep very well. And honestly, Varys isn't sure that the young king has made a choice, even now. Especially not with what the eunuch knows of Axel's extracurricular activities. Varys often finds himself grateful that he doesn't have those sorts of urges. To be controlled by one's cock, well, he's seen it be the ruin of many a man over the course of his life. And Axel Baratheon, for all that he's trying to be the best king he can be and has already proven to be a better king than both of his predecessors, is only a man at the end of the day. He might not have taken to whoring like Robert did, but if the things he got up to with the likes of Lady Stark and Lady Tyrell or Princess Arianne and Tyene Sand ever reached the wrong ears, there might very well be trouble. That was why Varys had been running interference for Axel for some time now, making sure that not a single whisper of his bedroom antics made their way to the likes of Baelish or anyone else who would want to take advantage of the king's indiscretions. Fortunately, it would seem that Lord Arryn had put his foot down for once. The Hand was notorious for going with the flow, trying his best not to disrupt the status quo, and letting Robert do whatever he wanted. But no longer, apparently. Jon had grown weary of letting kings do what they liked. And that meant Axel was going to have to choose. Even Varys couldn't guess just who he was going to pick at this point, but then the spymaster has been quite distracted recently by the consequences of his own foolish mistakes. Varys didn't necessarily regret sending the order to Esser Jorah to assassinate Daenerys, her newborn dragons, and her Red Priestess, in that order. Even though the king had said no assassination attempts, Varys knew it had to be done anyways for the good of the realm and for the good of Axel's reign. Really, the Master of Whispers' only regret was entrusting such an important task to a man who had turned out to ultimately be a fool. Esser Jorah had failed in his task. He had failed to kill Daenerys Targaryen, he had failed to kill even a single dragon whelp, and he'd of course failed to kill her Red Priestess for good measure. Failure all around. Admittedly, even weeks after he'd received the first reports of Esser Jorah's failure and subsequent execution, details of how it actually happened were sparse. And Varys had been reaching out to all of his contacts, trying his best to find out what was going on over there in Essos. Indeed, these last several weeks had resulted in quite a few sleepless nights for the spymaster. Between hiding the king's indiscretions from the court at large and trying to investigate what was happening with the Targaryen and her Red Priestess, he'd barely had the time for anything or anyone else, including Baelish. For instance, he knew that the Master of Coin had been up to something of late, but he'd had to put off investigating more deeply for the time being with his attention split in other directions. Besides, Baelish was running scared at this point and Varys knew it. With a couple nudges here and there from Varys, Axel and Jon were closing in on Baelish, weeding out the corruption in the city and tearing down the sordid empire that the conniving Master of Coin had built. It wouldn't be long before he slipped up and they caught him in a lie he could no longer get out of. Varys would be glad to see the other man go, truth be told. Back when the eunuch hadn't been sure that a lengthy Baratheon dynasty was what he wanted, the machinations and corruption of Petter Baelish had been useful in keeping the realm unstable in the event that a Targaryen restoration proved necessary. But now with everything flipped on its head and Daenerys Targaryen representing the very real threat of a sorceress lineage taking the Iron Throne, Baelish was simply in the way. Especially given what Varys had been able to hear from Essos. While he couldn't exactly find out how Jorah Mormont had failed to so much as kill one of his targets when said targets were nothing but a girl, a woman, and 3 dragon hatchlings, he had at least found out 2 very important pieces of information in the aftermath. First, Khal Drogo, Daenerys Targaryen's Dothraki husband, had been truly enraged by the attempt on his wife's life. Apparently, the two were far closer to one another than Varys had ever imagined them becoming. The Khal had taken the assassination as a personal insult and sworn to take his Khalasar to Westeros, across the Narrow Sea, no matter the cost. That also may have had less to do with Drogo's love for Daenerys and more to do with the second piece of information though. Namely, the fact that Daenerys Targaryen was apparently pregnant with the Dothraki Khal's child at this point. Would Varys have still given the order for her to die if he'd known she was with child? Yes, undoubtedly. But it did change things significantly all the same. If the last Targaryen was pregnant, then that presented the very real possibility of a dynasty of sorcery and magic. And that was the last thing Varys wanted to happen. He'd been wrestling with it since he received the news a couple days ago. Specifically, he hadn't been entirely sure how to break it to the king in his hand. Did he tell them everything, including that he'd tried to have Daenerys assassinated against Axel's direct instructions? Or did he simply tell them of her pregnancy and Drogo's intentions of turning his Khalasar towards Westeros at long last? In the end, he'd come to realize that they were only in this mess because of his subterfuge. And if he truly wanted Axel to be the best king that he could be, Varys was going to have to tell him the truth, even if it potentially resulted in his execution. He had already decided that he would tell them everything though, just in case his head truly did wind up leaving his shoulders afterwards. Not just about what was happening in Essos, but also the source of the corruption in King's Landing. He would give them everything he knew about Baelish and all of the other moves being made by the lords and ladies of Westeros. If Axel decided he needed to die afterwards, then so be it. At least Varys would know he'd prepared the young king as best as possible for what lay ahead. But first, he would wait for the arrival of Lord Baelish and Grandmaster Pycelle. He would wait for the king to announce his queen, and then he would speak to Lord Arryn and the king alone about all that he knew. Though truth be told, if they all had to wait much longer, he might as well tell them both now and get it over with. It was just the three of them here after all, and still neither Pycelle nor Petter were anywhere to be seen. It was a little strange if he was being honed. Just as the thought is passing through Varys' head, Pycelle finally arrives. The infirm and decrepit Grandmaster shuffles into the room with the usual stuttering, stammered apologies on his lips. My sincerest apologies, I was held up for a little while longer than expected. More than a little disgruntled, Lord Arryn waves a hand through the air dismissively. It is of little matter, Grandmaster, seeing as you aren't even the last one to the small council chambers this time. Where is Petter at? It's not at all usual for him to be this tardy. I might have to send a runner after him. It's fine. We'll wait a little longer first. The king breaks his silence just to say those words. From the conflicted look on Axel's face, it's obvious to Varys that he's happy to let anything put off the purpose of this meeting for a little while longer. Given the way Lord Arryn stares at him for a long moment, he no doubt suspects the same. I know this isn't easy, my king. But the decisions you have to make will often be hard. You can do this. I know you can. And prolonging this meeting won't make things any simpler either. Axel looks petulant for a moment before letting out a sigh and waving his hand in the direction of his Lord Commander. Fine. Sir Aris, go find Petter Baelish and bring him here immediately. The Kingsguard's Lord Commander salutes and departs from the small council chambers on his mission. At the same time, Pycelle grunts and groans and shuffles across the floor towards his usual chair like always. Meanwhile, Lord Arryn leans towards Axel, placing a hand on his arm and whispering quietly to him. It's as the Lord of the Vale is giving the king a bit of an inspirational talk, however, that Varys' eyes are drawn off to the side, something flickering in the sunlight coming in from the nearby windows. The Master of Whispers furrows his brow in confusion, staring somewhat baffled for a long moment before understanding begins to crystallize. It's a thin string of sorts, a thread that's almost invisible to the naked eye hovering at ankle height. And the reason that it's becoming visible is because Grandmaster Pycelle seems to be disrupting the string with his movements, pulling on it as he makes his way towards his seat. In fact, as Varys stares for a while longer, he realizes that the string is set up in such a way that only Pycelle would intercept and disturb it while going towards his seat. The thread seems to wind around Pycelle's chair in particular for a moment before disappearing under the table. Lips curling down into a frown of consternation, Varys slowly leans over in his chair. The sounds of Lord Arryn struggling to cheer the king up and Grandmaster Pycelle sighing as he settles into his chair fade into nothing but background noise for him as they wait for the Lord Commander to return with their missing Master of Coin. Instead, Varys focuses entirely on following the trembling, shaking string with his eyes until he's half turned over and looking under the length of the rather large small council table. There, he finds the strangest sight, a line of swaying small pots, hanging from a thicker rope that's connected just barely to the thinner, more invisible string. As they sway back and forth, Varys has to squint and strain his eyes to try and make out any sort of identification. But once he sees it, well, it's unmistakable. After all, how many of these pots had he dealt with mere months ago after the death of King Robert and his sons? Not personally maybe, but the Master of Whispers had certainly laid eyes on enough pots of wildfire to be able to recognize the symbol of the Alchemists' Guild on sight. His eyes widen and his mouth opens, but it's much too late. As Grandmaster Pycelle takes his seat, the invisible string snaps and that sets off a cascading effect that sends the swaying pots all falling down off of the rope to smash into the floor. Varys has always been quick mentally if not physically. He therefore has just enough time to belatedly realize this must have been Baelish. He'd let himself get distracted, focusing on Axel's dalliances and his own self-inflicted crisis brewing over in Essos. He hadn't kept a close enough eye on the scheming master of coins. Baelish must have decided they were too close to the truth. He must have decided to cut his losses and throw the realm into chaos by killing off the king and the rest of the small council at the same time. How he expected to get away with it, Varys did not know. Nor would he ever get the chance to find out either. For such an imbecilic blowhard of a fool to be his death, and for such base and selfish reasons as well, Varys straightens up in his chair, looking out into nothing as he lets out a rattling breath and three final words. How utterly vexing. And then the wildfire pots ignite and Varys' vision fills green flames as the entirety of the small council chambers violently explodes. XXX. A.N. Boom. Chapter 49. Burn. A.N. I'm sure you all want to see how Axel is doing after how last chapter ended. So anyways, here's a Baelish POV. XXX. King's Landing is far enough in the distance by now that Petter can barely see it on the horizon. Standing on the deck of the ship taking him, Lisa, and the future lord of the Eyrie to Goldtown, he stares out anyways, keeping it in view for as long as possible. Still, if all has gone to plan, and he's quite sure that it did, it should be done by this point. It's just too bad he won't have confirmation for some time yet. Petter. Do you think it's happened by now? Lisa comes up beside him and Petter looks around for a moment to make sure there's nobody nearby before giving her a sharp look and speaking in a quiet tone. Hush. Keep your voice down, my lady. To her credit, Lisa looks appropriately chagrined, also sneaking furtive glances around for a brief second. Of course, that only makes her look even more guilty, so Petter sighs and surreptitiously takes one of her hands in his own. This has the benefit of making her immediately focus back on him to the exception of everything else. Yes, it will have happened by now. It's done. But do remember that we can't know anything until the time is right. It's possible we'll hear the news in Goldtown, but it's also possible we won't be told until we reach the Eyrie. Until then, we must seem oblivious to any tragedy that might have taken place back in King's Landing. Lisa nods, wide-eyed and hanging off of Petter's every word just like always. Still. You should go back below deck. Be with your son, make sure he's not being too fussy, alright. That draws a certain look from the woman. Sometimes Petter wonders if Lisa Arryn even loves her only child. She'd had such a hard time finally producing an heir for her husband, only for Robert Arryn, otherwise known as Robin or Sweet Robin, to turn out to be a sickly, small boy, barely worth anything. Now to be fair, maybe he would grow out of it, but not with how much Lisa insisted on coddling and mothering the boy. She smothered young Robert, plain and simple. But then, Petter gained nothing from telling her she should stop, so he hadn't ever bothered pointing out the issue. Even still, despite her obvious love for the brat, there were times when her son was mentioned that Lisa almost looked like she hated him. Like she despised the child that had come from her old, decrepit lord husband. This was one of those times, but Petter doesn't let that stop him from nodding towards the doors that lead below deck. Go. We shouldn't be seen together too much. Finally, Lisa goes. Finally, he's free of her. Admittedly, Petter could have worst company to be fair. For instance, if he'd stayed in King's Landing much longer, he would have almost certainly wound up in the black cells under the Red Keep. There was simply no doubt in his mind that they were onto him and would have been coming for him shortly. In fact, when word had reached him about today's meeting and the only thing on the docket being the king choosing his queen, Petter hadn't bought it for 1 second. He fully believed if he'd shown up to the small council chambers today, he would have been arrested and thrown into a cell for his crimes. That's why he didn't show up, instead having some of the wildfire that he'd stolen during the cleanup process planted in the room and arranged for it to only go off once Grandmaster Pycelle finally arrived at the meeting. After all, if there was one thing that Pycelle could be counted on for, it was showing up late. Everyone else would be in attendance by the time he finally arrived, making sure that Petter would get all of them in one fell swoop. Well, all of them except for Stannis and Davos. If he thought he had more time, if he believed that he could afford to wait, then Petter might have held off until the other two men were back in the city as well. But he was so sure that they were coming after him today, he'd had to act. So act he did. He was officially a Kingslayer with this act. Axel Baratheon, Jon Arryn, Varys the Spider, Pycelle, and even Aris Oakheart, all of them were dead by his hand at this point. It left him feeling a little powerful, if he was being honest. Thanks to his antics in the training yard and his successful battles during the trial by the Seven, people had taken to calling Axel Baratheon the demon of the Trident come again. They said he was just like his father at his age, but you know what Petter saw when he looked at the young king? He saw Brandon Stark standing over him, sword dripping red with blood. And the only thing keeping the young lord from finishing him off were Catelyn Tully's hands on his arm, holding him back as she pleaded for Petter's life. Axel Baratheon and Brandon Stark had the same exact mentality in the end. The mentality that physical might makes right. So long as you were born with the right bloodline and were a deft hand with a sword, you could do anything you wanted and live however you liked. That was how men like those two thought. Well, the Mad King had proved Brandon quite wrong when he'd killed him and his father at the onset of the rebellion. And wouldn't you know, Petter had just used a type of fire to prove Axel wrong in a similar fashion. Petter allows a small smile to worm its way across his face, even as King's Landing continues to vanish into a smaller and smaller speck off in the distance. In a few more minutes, it would be completely gone and they would be well on their way to Gulltown already. From Gulltown, Petter and Lisa would travel with the young Robert Arryn and their complement of House Arryn guards up to the Eyrie. There, once news of the deaths in King's Landing reached them, Lisa would take charge of the Vale as Lady Regent. After a bit more time for everything else to truly kick off, she would then name Petter as her son's regent until he came of age, if he ever came of age, that is. Meanwhile, back in King's Landing, those who would no doubt investigate the incident would find exactly what Petter intended them to find. They would find documentation detailing Jon Arryn releasing his wife and heir into Petter's custody and giving Petter leave to escort them back to the Eyrie. A couple of half-written rough drafts in Jon's office and the final letter in Petter's. Said document bore Jon's seal and forged signature, and without the older man around to refute it, they were ironclad. Especially since Lisa would, of course, back Petter to the hilt. Furthermore, those left in King's Landing would be caught off guard in the coming days as the Ironborn declared war on the Seven Kingdoms and began reaving all up and down the west coast of Westeros without reservation under their new Lord Reaper, Euron Greyjoy. If all had gone according to plan on his end, then Euron would have killed Balon by now and declared himself ruler of the Ironborn. In this case, it would have been natural for a Kingsmoot would then take place in order to decide the Ironborn's next leader. After all, Balon's natural heir was a prisoner in Winterfell and his only daughter was on the other side of Westeros, stuck in King's Landing. But Euron had reluctantly agreed via letter that there simply wasn't enough time and claimed he could take control without bothering with the ancient Ironborn tradition. There was a world where the hounds might not have nipped at Petter's heels quite so fast. If Axel were just a bit less fiscally minded, then maybe Petter and Euron would have had all the time in the world to enact their original plans, even. They'd involved Petter poisoning Jon and sticking around King's Landing for a little while longer, even while Euron was winning a proper Kingsmoot before taking leadership of his people and declaring independence. But alas, it was not to be. They'd forced his hand, and with Petter moving things up and escalating his plans, Euron had been forced to do the same. Petter didn't quite know how Euron intended to completely bypass the need for a Kingsmoot. But the other man was absolutely certain that even without one, he would have control of the Ironborn almost immediately somehow. Not knowing the details vexed Petter quite a bit, but at least the Vale was about as far away from the Ironborn's many targets as possible, so in the end he wasn't too worried. No, in fact, he was feeling rather comfortable at this point. Sure, he regretted that he couldn't get the entire small council, but in a way, it was better that Stannis and Davos of all people had survived. In fact, their survival allowed Petter to have his last remaining operatives in King's Landing plant rumors saying that Stannis had arranged the explosion. Admittedly, the lords of Westeros weren't likely to buy it, but if they did, well, that would be quite hilarious. It might throw the entire realm into war again right as Euron was starting his attacks. But even if it didn't, even if Stannis managed to avoid being accused of the crime of kingslaying, Peter's own alibi remained airtight and honestly, Stannis Baratheon becoming king of the Seven Kingdoms was also quite good for Peter's purposes. Sure, the man would probably dismiss Peter as master of coin once Lisa named him regent, but that would be just fine by him since he'd more than made sure to clean up after himself on his way out of King's Landing. Meanwhile, Stannis' moral inflexibility, general disposition, and complete lack of a small council would leave him thinking that he had to bring the hammer down on even the smallest indiscretions in his new court. Yes, Stannis was very much a hammer. And all he knew how to be was a hammer. And something that a hammer like him didn't know was this: the harder a hammer tries to hammer, the more everyone else will go to ground. Even the most honorable men have vices. Even the purest of women have needs. Not everyone could be as emotionless and dutiful as Stannis Baratheon. And not everyone was Davos Seaworth, willing to lose fingers for the plain and simple act of saving a starving garrison. No, even if Stannis managed to avoid accusations of kingslaying, he would still find himself dealing with Euron Greyjoy's rebellion, and without nearly the support that Robert had during the last Ironborn rebellion. More than that, his inflexibility would force more and more people to turn to illicit services, and that was where Petyr Baelish thrived. It was a shame, really. It wasn't even that personal for Petyr. Jon Arryn had been good to him throughout his life, but Petyr Baelish had learned long ago that he didn't owe anything to anyone but himself. If Axel had been more like his father and Jon had continued to be blind to Petyr's activities, then perhaps neither man would have had to die quite this early. Varys though, by the seven, Petyr wishes he could have seen the look on the spider's face when the wildfire went off. Keeping the whole scheme a secret from the Master of Whispers had taken up quite a lot of Petyr's resources and energy over the past few weeks. Even as he and Euron had both moved their pieces into place and prepared to enact their plans, separate from one another but also simultaneously, he'd been making sure Varys didn't find out. Fortunately, the spider had been distracted by something else. What that something was, Petyr didn't rightly know, nor did he care either. After all, it wasn't like it mattered anymore. The man was dead and the games they'd played with one another were officially over. They were all dead, while Petyr still lived. Where they all had fallen, he remained standing. Because unlike everyone else, Petyr understood that life could be boiled down to just opportunities and costs. More than that, life was chaos. Unstructured, disorganized, endless chaos. And chaos was a ladder. Petyr understood that better than most because he'd started at the bottom of that ladder. Those who started at the top, they could never understand the climb. Someone like Axel Baratheon couldn't begin to comprehend what Petyr had gone through. It didn't matter anymore though. Axel Baratheon was dead, burnt to a crisp by the wildfire. Petyr would just have to take advantage of the chaos his death left in its wake. XXX. Fire. Green flames, followed by darkness, followed by green flames, followed by darkness. Axel Baratheon burns, but he does not die. He burns, but he still draws breath. Every last inhale and exhale is agony, yet still he lives. The flames become his entire existence. They cover him from head to toe, clinging to him and drinking of his flesh, his blood, his body quite greedily. All Axel knows is the sensation of burning, of fire biting at his form again and again as any healing is undone by more flames. The last thing he remembers from before the fire is Jon Arryn's face. The man who had kept him safe in the Vale throughout his childhood. The man who had brought him to King's Landing, seen him coronated as king, and mentored him in all the things he needed to know. Jon had been saying something about how he knew Axel would make the right call, how he trusted him. He'd been smiling at Axel, reaching out and grasping his shoulder. And then the flames had come, both too slow and too fast. There wasn't anything Axel could do. Caught off guard as he was, he hadn't been able to react in time. Maybe if he'd been facing the source of the explosion rather than Jon, but he hadn't been. And yet, he'd still had to watch. He'd had to watch as Jon's face had burned away inch by inch. Axel watched as the closest thing he'd ever had to a father turned into an unrecognizable, charred husk right before his eyes in what must have been a mere instant but wound up feeling like an eternity. That was the last thing Axel saw before the green flames filled his vision and then took that vision away from him. Darkness and burning became his only two constants. He's not sure how long it lasts. Only that when he finally comes back to himself, the green flames finally dying out, Axel is no longer in the small council chambers. Instead, he finds himself in the great sept of all places, kneeling in front of the statue of the father, naked and trembling. Not from the cold draft moving through the space, but from deep emotion. Staring up at the father's statue, Axel Baratheon shakes, with pure and utter rage. XXX. Yeah, so I did originally consider ending this chapter on just Baelish's paw, but then I figured you might all try to kill me if I did that, so here you go. One more chapter left in Arc 3 and then we get to Arc 4, and shit really starts to go wild. Chapter 50. Aftermath. This might shock some people, but Stannis really doesn't want to be king. XXX. Stannis races back to King's Landing as fast as humanly possible after receiving message by Raven. Unfortunately, the written word proves wholly inadequate for explaining what actually happened. That there was another wildfire explosion is clear. That it took place in the small council chambers during a meeting is also clear. However, the rest of it is far less clear. In fact, the Lord Paramount of Storm's End is left with the mistaken impression that he's just become the rightful king of Westeros, and ironically, he finds that he doesn't really want it. Sure, maybe after Robert's death he might have wanted to be king. Though, he hadn't even been given a chance to entertain the idea because he was away at Dragonstone when it happened. As a result, the news of Robert and his son's dying came at the same time as the news of Axel's legitimization and Jon's departure to the Vale to retrieve him. But now that he was finally given his due and recognized for his efforts by his nephew. Having Axel die so young and being forced to take his place was the last thing Stannis wanted. They were just beginning to stabilize the realm, just beginning to work their way out of the hole that Robert dug them. And now, this. Of course, ultimately it wasn't ever about what Stannis wanted. It was about his duty. Even if he didn't want to be king, he was the next in line for the throne and he had a responsibility to the Seven Kingdoms that could not be ignored. Except, upon arriving in King's Landing, Stannis found out that all was not as it seemed in more ways than one. Most importantly of all, Axel Baratheon was not dead. The missive he'd received had been truthful, to be fair. It had simply been woefully incomplete. But then, how did you even begin to tell a tale as insane as this one over a simple letter? How did you even consider committing it to text without being able to provide proof of what had happened, what was still happening? The small council was convened in their chambers when the wildfire went off. The king, his hand, the master of whispers, and the Grandmaster were all in attendance. Meanwhile, Esser Aris, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, had just been sent to retrieve a missing master of coin mere moments before the explosion went off. Jon Arryn, Varys the Spider, and Grandmaster Pycelle were all very, very dead. This was indisputable, as their charred remains had been identified from the burnt-out husk of the small council chambers once the wildfire had finally died out days later. Axel Baratheon, though, kept breathing. Not just that, he kept moving. When the first of the Red Keep's servants had arrived on the scene, they'd wisely kept their distance. Of course they did. After all, anyone would upon seeing the horrifying green flames licking at stone that had so thoroughly occupied the city's nightmares for months. But even as the servants kept their distance, they reported someone walking out of the flames. There were too many witnesses to call them crazy as well, and Stannis had come to see the proof with his own eyes at this point too. What would later be identified as Axel Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Andals and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm, walked out of the small council chambers under his own power. Burning brightly with enough green flames to send the less courageous onlookers running, leaving nothing but ash and footprints flickering with green flames behind him, Axel Baratheon had walked, and walked. There was no covering up what had happened, not when the burning king had walked right out of the Red Keep and into the city. Many had fled from him in fear and confusion, but many others had stayed and watched from hastily found hiding places as the unrecognizable king had made his way through the streets of King's Landing. His only source of identification was the Valyrian steel sword clutched tightly in one of his fists. Rosethorn as it had been known when Loras Tyrell wielded it. Stoneheart as it had been renamed once it came into Axel Baratheon's possession. It had fused with his burning hand, the pommel destroyed by the wildfire but the Valyrian steel remaining unmarred. Axel hadn't wandered aimlessly either. He'd gone straight from the Red Keep to the Great Sept of Baelor. Even though eyewitnesses reported him having no face most of the time, his head a burning mass of wildfire just like the rest of him, the king took no detours and made no stops along the way. Just one impossible moving foot in front of the other until finally, he arrived at his destination and knelt before the statue of the father in the center of the Great Sept. Some assumed that he would die then, once he stopped walking, as though a great force of will and a truly pious heart had moved him to reach that spot as his final resting place and no further. But no, by the time Stannis reached the city days later, Axel Baratheon still lived. Even as he burned, he still breathed rattling breath after rattling breath. The Kingsguard, led by Esser Aris, had taken up positions around the Great Sept and in a somewhat controversial move, would let no one enter without their say-so. Fortunately, their actions were backed by the High Septon and the most devout, who all seemed to be waiting with bated breath to see what would happen next. Stannis himself took to investigating this insanity the moment he arrived in the city and had gained a semblance of real knowledge. He'd tried his best to make sense of the chaos of what had happened. In the end, the Lord Paramount had some success, but ultimately he still had more questions than answers, especially given the news that had arrived from the west in more recent days. Still, when he received notice this morning that the situation in the Great Sept had changed, Stannis had rushed down with all haste. Axel Baratheon had burned for 7 days and 7 nights in total, but at long last, he burned no more. Wildfire burned long, not this long, a small voice in the back of Stannis' mind points out, but it didn't and couldn't burn forever. Learned men knew this, but in the eyes of the small folk, well, the 7 days and 7 nights were seen as a sign. It didn't help that it was already being preached as a sign by the faith on every street corner in King's Landing. Stannis just grimaces as he stands there in the middle of the Great Sept a few feet away from his naked nephew. Axel's body is completely healed somehow, without a single scar or blemish. He's also completely hairless. The king has been rendered bald by the wildfire. The green flames had burned away all his hair, all his flesh, and should have burned the rest of him too, but hadn't. Instead, Axel still lived and he kneels before the statue of the father, unmoving and silent. Normally, Stannis would have broken the quiet by now, but even he can't bring himself to speak. It's not until Axel finally rises to his feet after an indeterminate amount of time that Stannis surges forward, wrapping the cloak in his hands around the broad shoulders of his extremely tall nephew. The king jolts at the touch, before reaching up and taking hold of the cloak, his fingers feeling along its edge for a moment. His eyes remain fixed upon the father's statue, but finally, he breaks his silence. Who? His voice, quiet and even, nevertheless echoes through the otherwise silent Great Sept. Axel's tone is filled with emotion. Grief. Sorrow. Rage. Fury. Stannis hears it all and he's always been told he's rather terrible at reading other people. Not today though. Not with Axel. He can practically feel the other man's emotions radiating off of him as he stands there, still as a statue. Scowling for a moment, Stannis flicks his eyes towards the doors of the Great Sept. Some are wondering if it was I who orchestrated the attack. They claim I certainly had the motive. He doesn't know why he says it like that. Is he complaining? Is he simply putting it out there now so Axel hears it from his mouth instead of anyone else's? In the end, he needn't have worried. Axel scoffs at the very idea. Who would be fool enough to think that? Stannis doesn't smile, but his lips do take on a firmly grim satisfaction as he looks again towards the doors. Your Kingsguard has taken to protecting you by encircling the Great Sept since you arrived here. Esser Marin Trant almost barred me entry this morning on the grounds that I may have been the one to arrange the attack on you. Fortunately, Esser Aris set him straight. Axel hums, still staring up at the statue of the father. How did I get here from the Red Keep anyways? Frowning, Stannis looks to the floor, where even now Axel's ashen footprints can be seen. The wildfire flames he left in his wake have all gone out days ago by this point thankfully, but the path he'd carved from the Red Keep all the way to the Great Sept nevertheless remains untouched. There are some among the faith that are even calling the spots where his feet fell evidence of hallowed ground. If they have their way, they'll have named Axel's route through the city by the end of the week. Something like, Path of the Blessed King, or whatever, Stannis imagines. You don't remember. You walked, Your Grace. You walked all the way here under your own power. Again, Axel falls silent for a time. And yet, his very presence seems to fill the space around them, sending a shiver down Stannis' spine. When he finally speaks, he changes the subject. Esser Trant is an idiot. I'm glad to hear that Esser Aris survived. I suppose he was lucky we sent him to retrieve Baelish before the wildfire went off. The tension in Stannis' shoulders relaxes just a smidgen as Axel confirms Esser Aris' alibi. Admittedly, Stannis had been a little suspicious of the Lord Commander's tale, but at the same time he'd had ample opportunity to try to finish the job these past 7 days. In the end, the Lord Paramount could admit that he hadn't truly believed that Aris had anything to do with it. More concerning is the monotone that the king has begun speaking in. Stannis almost preferred when Axel was more emotional, because now it seems that his rage has gone completely cold. Straightening up, Stannis works his jaw for a moment, before finally speaking. I can't say for certain who did this yet, but I have my suspicions. Petyr Baelish wasn't just absent from the small council chambers when the wildfire exploded, he was absent from the city altogether. He'd left King's Landing alongside Lisa and Robert Arryn over an hour before the meeting was scheduled to take place. Axel doesn't speak. He doesn't move. In fact, he goes absolutely still at those words. What? Stannis grimaces, feeling another icy cold shiver run down his spine. He does not consider himself a weak man. He does not consider himself craven. And yet, standing in Axel's presence right now is like nothing he's ever experienced. Perhaps it's having seen the young king while he was still burning, kneeling there at the foot of the father's statue. But no matter. Stannis steels himself and focuses. In the course of my investigation, I found documentation in both the Tower of the Hand and the Master of Coin's office detailing a trip by sea that Baelish supposedly had approval to go on. According to the documents, which were stamped with Lord Arryn's seal and signed with his signature, Petyr Baelish was to escort the Lord of the Ares' wife and child back to the Vale before returning to King's Landing. Pausing to take a breath, Stannis shakes his head. Through Sir Ara's testimony, I have my suspicions about the veracity of these documents, Your Grace. I hope you can confirm them for me. The Master of Coin did not have leave from either you or Lord Arryn to depart from King's Landing, did he? The question hangs in the air unanswered for a long moment before Axel finally shakes his head. Number. He did not. Jon would have told me. He didn't mention it. He didn't understand why Petyr was late to the meeting any more than the rest of us. Stannis grunts and bows his head. That was their man then. At the very least, it sounded like he knew of the attack and planned to escape without telling anyone. Then I suspect we might have our culprit, but there is more, Your Grace. What is it? Axel's tone is terse, clipped. But Stannis can't exactly blame the younger man. This is all a bit much, even for Stannis. Not least of which because he's exchanging words with a man who should be dead. Don't get him wrong, he's glad Axel still lives. But it was unnatural all the same. Euron Greyjoy has broken his exile from the Iron Islands. Rumors abound about the exact order of events, whether Balon Greyjoy died before Euron revealed himself or whether Euron killed him first. But it doesn't seem to matter which it is. The Ironborn have rallied behind him and he's declared himself king. Ironborn ships have begun reaving up and down the continent's west coast. Some of the people Stannis had talked to, like Davos Seaworth, had been confused by the Ironborn's behavior. Even Asha Greyjoy, daughter to Balon Greyjoy, was reportedly outraged that the Ironborn had not at least followed their ancient traditions and called a Kingsmoot. Supposedly, their actions didn't make sense even within the context of their own twisted, vile sort of honor. Personally, Stannis didn't think much of the Ironborn. It didn't surprise him one bit that the savages couldn't even be trusted to keep to their own traditions. Whatever Euron Greyjoy had done to make the Ironborn follow him despite his infamous reputation and the lack of a Kingsmoot, it didn't really matter, did it? It happened. Now they had to deal with it. Of course, Axel just stands there silently, staring up at the father's statue some more. His hands curled into fists at his sides, the king trembles with anger and grief alike. Stannis holds his tongue. He wants to ask, of course. The question that's almost certainly on everyone's mind. How did the king survive? The wildfire wasn't diluted or anything like that. It had killed Jon Arryn, Varys, and Pycelle instantly. And then it had burned across Axel's body for an entire week before finally dying out. So how the fuck had Axel Baratheon survived? How did he still live? Was it truly the Seven as the most devout and High Septon were already preaching? Had they blessed Axel Baratheon and kept him alive against all odds? Stannis had never been very religious, admittedly. He paid lip service to the Seven because it was the done thing, but he'd never put much stock in the gods, neither the old nor the new. And yet, here was a miracle, right before his eyes. Axel Baratheon had knelt and burned in the center of the Great Sept for 7 days and 7 nights, and then he had risen completely healed, his flesh pristine and blemish-free. If that wasn't divine will, then what else could it be? XXX. Oh man, if even Stannis is thinking it's divine will, what the fuck is everyone else in King's Landing thinking? Anyways, this right here marks the end of Arc 3. Tomorrow we start Arc 4, and don't worry, Petyr Baelish has made himself Axel's #1 priority. Chapter 51, Diplomacy. Arc 4 begins with a diplomatic summit between two warring camps, Law. XXX. Lady Sansa. My apologies for the disturbance, but would you mind very much if I sat for a while? The look that the she-wolf levels in Ariane's direction is naturally icy, even as she remains kneeling in the middle of the Red Keep's Godswood. She doesn't look all that surprised by Ariane's arrival though. Perhaps she was even expecting this to happen eventually. I didn't take you for someone who cared much for the old gods, princess. Ariane's own lips quirk up into a half smile as she offers a helpless little shrug, looking around the clearing before focusing on the heart tree that Sansa was praying at. Desperate times and all that. If you wish for me to leave, I will. Silence falls, and for a moment she thinks that the redhead might actually take her up on that offer and send her away. But then Sansa's eyes move past her, taking in the fact that Ariane is by herself. It's just the two of them in the heart tree's clearing. I see you came alone. Finally, after another lengthy pause, the she-wolf nods. Very well. You may stay. Ariane smiles a bit more brightly at that, before taking a seat on a nearby bench. Sansa doesn't reprimand her for it though. They both know why Ariane is really here, and it's not to pray to Sansa's ancient nature gods. Still, out of respect, she waits until Sansa finally pulls herself up from in front of the heart tree and rises to her feet, moving and sitting on the bench across from her. Even then the northern woman says not a word, forcing Ariane to break the silence between them. Have you been to see him yet? They both know who him is, of course. Sansa nods slowly, her eyes regarding Ariane carefully yet also calmly. I have. We exchanged a few words after he finally returned to the Red Keep. You. Ariane nods back, humming as she shifts from side to side for a moment. Yes. I noticed his hair has already begun to grow back in. And, he has stubble on his face as well. I noticed the same. No deception, no subterfuge. Just blunt honesty. Now, Ariane has had to reevaluate her opinion of Sansa Stark multiple times since she first arrived in King's Landing, but she thinks she would be able to tell if the other woman was lying. Especially about something like this. She's not though, which means that for them to have both noticed the slight scratch on his chin and upper lip, he'd kissed them both. Silence falls as they each absorb that fact. Admittedly, Ariane finds herself contemplating other things as well. Like the pure insanity that was this past week. Everything had been turned on its head with that wildfire explosion. And nobody seemed to know how to react to it either. Axel had lived, but at what cost? For a time, the prevailing opinion had been that he wouldn't survive, or if he did survive, he would be crippled for the rest of his life. No one had actually thought that he would come out the other side of the attack seemingly unscathed like he did. But then, there were more types of wounds than just the physical, weren't there? Axel might be fully healed, but Jon Arryn was still dead, as was the Master of Whispers and Grandmaster Pycelle. The small council was in shambles and the Ironborn had declared war on the Seven Kingdoms. It really put things into perspective, didn't it? Did you ever see him while he was still burning? Sansa stiffens at that question. Then, she slowly shakes her head. No. I didn't even try. I've seen the footprints where he walked. That was enough for me. An admission of weakness, some might say. But looking at her, Ariane didn't think that Lady Sansa was very weak at all. No, she would be a fool to treat her competition like some feeble, fretful maiden. Still, one good concession deserves another. I tried. For the first time, Ariane can tell she surprises Sansa just a little bit. The other woman's eyes widen ever so slightly as she looks at Ariane in shock. Smiling somewhat ruefully, the Dornish princess shrugs a single shoulder. I tried to gain entry to the Great Sept of Baelor, but the Kingsguard and the Goldcloaks turned me away. Oh, and how vexing that had been. Not that Ariane had let them truly stop her. She'd sent Tyene next. Her loyal handmaiden and close confidant was perfectly suited for disguising herself as a septa. And seeing how the septons and septas were the only ones still allowed to come and go from the Great Sept during what they were now calling the Seven's Burning, Tyene had been able to sneak in and get her eyes on the king while he'd still been aflame. Ariane struggled to imagine what it might have looked like even now, truth be told. Tyene hadn't been much help in that department, though the way that her friend had reacted to what she'd seen was very illuminating in its own right. For all her pious and innocent facade, Tyene was not actually the most religious of individuals. Not by a long shot. And yet, when Tyene had come back from the Great Sept to report to Ariane, the princess had seen it in her handmaiden's eyes. Shock. Awe. Faith. What Tyene had seen was, apparently, enough to make the Sand Snake fully believe that the Seven were real. More than that, she now professed a belief that the Seven were working in the material world directly through the form of Axel Baratheon, first of his name. Arianne wasn't sure what she believed, but she definitely wasn't foolish enough to disagree with Tyene. The other woman's fervent words had been more than a little perturbing, truth be told, but then, it was just like she'd told Sansa. These were strange, difficult times, weren't they? Desperate, that was the word she'd used mere minutes ago. And desperate times called for desperate measures. Lady Sansa, I came here today because I hope to call for a truce. And perhaps reach a greater level of understanding between us. She catches Sansa off guard again with that. The other woman's eyes narrow and for a moment she studies Arianne as if she doesn't fully believe her. Which, fair. But finally, Sansa lets out a shuddering breath and repeats the Dornish princess's words with an icy tone. A truce. Nodding, Arianne sighs. Yes, a truce. Now is not the time for us to be trying to score points against one another. And I highly doubt that the king will be making a choice anyways in the coming days. Not with everything that's been happening. It's a shame really, because Arianne had it on good authority that the very small council meeting where the wildfire explosion took place was going to be the one where Axel would have announced his would-be queen. But that had all fallen to the wayside now, and admittedly for good reason. In the end, she decides that she might as well be honest with her rival. At this point, their entire competition feels petty. The thing is, I can't go back to Dorne. Even if Axel does choose you over me when this is all over, I think I might just prefer fleeing to Essos and living in exile rather than returning to Sunspear. At Sansa's shocked, incredulous look, Arianne smiles and shrugs. My father, he's always hated me for some reason. I don't know why, but I do know that whether the king marries me or not, I will never be allowed to rule Dorne. My younger brother is going to inherit my father's seat no matter what happens to me here. Taking a deep breath, Arianne continues on, staring down at her hands. If I do return to Dorne, then all I have to look forward to is a gilded cage. My father will continue to offer me old and decrepit men as prospective husbands, knowing full well I won't accept them. I will be honest, Lady Stark, I was trapped in Sunspear, like a rat in a cage. King's Landing has been the freest I've ever felt in my entire life. In fact, I would rather join Lady Tyrell as yours and the king's pet than return to my homeland. Sansa stiffens in response to that last bit, causing Arianne to smile ruefully. Yes, she knew about Marjorie Tyrell. But to be fair, she's sure that Sansa knows about Tyene as well. They both have their assets, in the end, don't they? For a long moment, Sansa is silent, mulling over Arianne's words. Finally though, the redhead nods. A truce then. I won't lie and pretend that the life waiting for me in the north is anywhere close to what you just described awaits you in Dorne. But I won't lie, I would rather stay in King's Landing as the king's mistress than return home, even if he does pick you as his queen. I'm not sure I can live without him anymore. This past week has been. Sansa trails off, looking a strange mixture of aggrieved and frustrated with herself. Without really thinking about it, Arianne reaches over and takes one of Sansa's hands in her own, startling the she-wolf and making her look at her in shock. Smiling softly, Arianne squeezes Sansa's hand. Axel loves us both. I truly believe that. So in the end, forget being rivals. I would much rather have you as my friend than my enemy, Lady Stark. I feel the same, Princess Martell. XXX. Outside of the Godswood, Marjorie scowls, arms crossed over her chest as she narrows her eyes at a serenely smiling Tyene Sand. She should have brought Brienne with her apparently, but then to be fair, she hadn't expected to run into the Princess of Dorne's handmaiden on her way to see Sansa. Nor had she anticipated being barred from entering one of the most open locations in the entire Red Keep. You have no right to stop me from going into the Godswood. You're right, my lady. All I can do is ask you to wait a little while longer. The princess and Lady Stark will almost certainly finish their conversation soon. Yes, and that was the problem. What were they talking about? Marjorie needed to know. She needed to understand where she stood. Before wildfire wiped out half of the small council and nearly killed the king, she'd actually been somewhat comfortable as Sansa Stark's second, as her handmaiden. Sure, she'd had the tables turned on her by the other woman rather ruthlessly and found herself completely and utterly submitting to the Northern Lady, but it wasn't an unpleasant experience. And so long as Sansa wished to keep her maidenhead intact, Marjorie got to play the role of go-between for Axel and her. She got to experience more of that amazing, fat cock that the king sported. But now, Marjorie didn't even know where to begin. Some very important men were dead. Axel should have died, but they were saying the seven had saved him, and frankly, Marjorie believed it. And now the Princess of Dorne and her handmaiden were playing games to keep Marjorie and Sansa apart. Sure, Tyene technically didn't have any authority to keep Marjorie out of the Godswood, but Marjorie wasn't a fool. Tyene's sand might seem innocent and as fragile as glass, but Marjorie didn't trust it. She'd seen the other sand snakes in action, and she suspected that all three of the ones in King's Landing were as dangerous as one another, each in their own way. Technically, she could have just walked past Tyene at this point. But she didn't know what the other woman would do if she tried. She wasn't at all certain of what Tyene Sand was capable of. That fear and uncertainty had kept her rooted in place for the last several minutes, all while the bitch stared at her in near silence. You shouldn't be afraid of me, you know. Jolted out of her thoughts, Marjorie looks to see Tyene still smiling at her serenely. Coloring, the Lady of Highgarden huffs. I'm not afraid of you. Yes you are. But it's alright. The blessed king enjoys your company. And you know your place too. So long as you do not try to rise above your station, you have nothing to fear from me. I swear upon the seven who are one that no harm will come to you so long as you continue to hold the blessed king's favor. A shiver runs down Marjorie's spine. Creepy fucking bitch. XXX. Asha Greyjoy gnashes her teeth as she stands on the balcony just outside of her guest rooms in the Red Keep. Her hands grip the railing hard enough that the bones grind together. None of this made any fucking sense. Not the wildfire bullshit or Axel surviving it. That was, well, it was weird sure. But Asha didn't really care all that much except to be grateful that Axel still lived. It didn't matter that he should have died, he hadn't, and that was all that mattered. But how the fuck had Euron Greyjoy gained control of the Iron Islands without so much as a whisper of a kingsmoot? Bad enough that her bastard uncle had apparently slipped right past her and killed her father. Asha didn't believe the rumors of Euron only showing up after Balon had an accident, for even a second, damn it. Even still, Balon's death should have triggered a kingsmoot, for all that it was an ancient tradition. His only living son was Theon fucking Greyjoy, and Asha knew her brother was never going to inherit the Seastone chair if their people had anything to say about it. That just left her, but of course she was halfway across the world and a woman to boot. Which really just left Balon's brothers, of which 3 remained. The youngest of her uncles, Aeron Greyjoy, was a priest of the drowned god who went by the name Damfair. He wasn't really in the running. But her other uncle, Victarion Greyjoy, definitely should have been, even if he was a bit of an idiot. And Victarion was the very reason that Euron had been exiled from the Iron Islands in the first place. Except, rather than there being a kingsmoot and some discussion about whether it should be Victarion or Euron who should inherit the Seastone chair and title of Lord Reaper of Pike, Euron had just seized it. And apparently done so without any bloodshed either. Save for her father's anyways. There were no rumors of Victarion dying alongside her father. And not a single bit of scuttlebutt regarding Ironborn who weren't siding with Euron. It shouldn't have been possible, but somehow Euron had come back from exile and united the Ironborn behind him almost effortlessly. He'd done it so quickly and so swiftly that he'd then gone on to declare himself king of the Iron Islands and declared war on all of Westeros. All before Axel Baratheon had even stopped burning. Admittedly, real news traveled slowly, and in the coming days, Asha might learn more about just how her exiled uncle had done this. But right now, the Ironborn woman is more confused by how Euron took control of the Iron Islands than she is by Axel surviving the wildfire. It just didn't make any damn sense. XXX. Poor Asha. She is confusion. Chapter 52. The New Hand. Axel needs a new hand. Hey look, there's one now. XXX. Physically, Axel is already completely fine. Despite burning for a week straight, he's healed in full somehow. Even wildfire hadn't proven enough to put him down. Really, the only remaining signs of what he'd gone through were the shortness of his hair, which was still growing back in, and the stubble upon his face. Apparently, repeatedly losing all of his flesh to wildfire and having it regrow over and over again finally made him capable of growing a beard. Honestly, there had been a time when Axel had wondered if he would ever be able to grow facial hair. He still remembered some of the men from the mountain clans over in the Vale giving him shit about it, in fact, before he kicked some teeth in and broke a few jaws, of course. And yet, he'd gladly give up the ability to grow a beard if it meant that he could have Jon back. Unfortunately, the old man was gone and he wasn't coming back. And as much as it fucking hurt, Axel knew that the last thing Jon would want him to do is wallow in his grief. No, if anything, now wasn't the time to be sitting around pouting over his own failures. Now was the time for action. Now was the time for initiative. That was why he'd called for his uncle Stannis Baratheon to attend him. The moment that the older man enters the room, Axel turns away from the window he was staring at and points at the table. I'm making you the hand of the king, effective immediately. Accept and put on the damn pin. His uncle stiffens for a moment, eyes moving to follow Axel's finger to where the hand of the king's badge of office sits on the table. It's not the one that Jon Arryn wore, of course. That melted down to nothing in the wildfire. But having another made wasn't that difficult or time-consuming, in the end. Finally, after a deliberate pause, Stannis walks over to the table and scoops up the pin, affixing it to his chest. Axel nods his approval. Good. You'll remain master of laws for now as well. We'll figure out who will replace you in that position later. Have you spoken with Lord Davos about the state of the royal fleet yet? Stannis nods sharply, proving already that Axel has made the right decision. I have, Your Grace. The royal fleet is coming together as fast as possible. I've also had the late Grandmaster's apprentices send ravens to all of the 7 kingdoms calling them to war. Ironborn ships have already begun reeving up and down the coast. Reports say they've only been hitting small fishing villages so far, but it's only a matter of time. Axel just grunts. I'm sure it is. We'll stop them. And I'll kill Euron Greyjoy with my bare hands for whatever part he had to play in Jon's death. His new hand nods decisively at that, before hesitates briefly. Axel waves a hand, wordlessly telling him to speak his damn mind. What of Petyr Baelish and Lysa Arryn up in the Vale? They will soon arrive at the area if they aren't there already, and word of your survival will no doubt reach them as well. If they're as guilty as we suspect, they might try to flee. Axel smiles grimly at that, shaking his head. It doesn't matter, I don't intend to give them the chance to run. I'm going to go to the Vale personally and deal with them myself. I'll put them both to the question and find out just how deep this rot extends, no matter what it takes. Grim-faced and dour as ever, Stannis just nods again. Understood. I'll have an escort assembled immediately and... No. Don't bother. I'm going alone, I'll be faster that way. That claim shocks his uncle, of course. Stannis Baratheon's brow furrows in confusion. Alone, Your Grace. I'm not sure I understand. That wouldn't be safe, for a number of reasons. Letting out a sigh, Axel considers things for a moment. He doesn't blame Stannis for his confusion or his concern. In the end, this was all his fault, ultimately. He should have been on the lookout for something like the wildfire scheme. He should have seen it coming. He should have trained his reflexes more. He was fast when he wanted to be. Extremely fast. But he could only move as quickly as he could react, and when the wildfire had gone off, Axel had been distracted. He hadn't been paying attention, too lost in his own world and pitying himself for having to choose between 2 very beautiful women. Jon Arryn paid the price for that. There was a world where Axel could have been more alert. More observant. Where he might have been able to grab the other man and throw them both out the window ahead of the explosion. He'd shielded and cushioned Jon's fall once before after all, back on the high road. But he would never know what could have been because you didn't get second chances in life. You didn't get do-overs. Jon was dead and Axel would always carry some of the blame for that with himself. Still, he was done playing games. He was done hiding. They'd all seen him burn and burn. The faith was already calling it a miracle from the 7 because he'd apparently burned for exactly 7 days and 7 nights or some shit. There were even all sorts of titles being bandied about, both for the event and for him. The people loved him because the High Septon and the most devout loved him. And that was all thanks to Jon. All thanks to his advice, his plan to get the faith of the 7 on their side. Really, what was the point of holding anything back anymore? What was the point of hiding any longer, now that Jon was dead? Draw your sword. Stannis blinks in confusion, but nevertheless does what he's told. Obedient and loyal, that's his uncle to the hilt. Stepping over to the table, Axel pulls up his sleeve, exposing his pristine, blemish-free arm. He lays it on the table and nods to it. Cut off my hand. Now comes the resistance though. Even a man as dutiful and loyal as Stannis Baratheon has his limits. His new hand box, eyes widening in disbelief. What? You can't be serious. I'm very serious, Lord Hand. Consider it an order from your king. Cut off my hand. Don't hold anything back, Stannis. When the older man continues to hesitate, Axel finally throws him a bone. I healed from being covered in wildfire from head to toe, uncle. Do you really think a blade will be the death of me? That prompts a flash of understanding in the other man's still confused eyes. Nodding slowly, Stannis finally steps forward and raises his sword above his head. And then, with a hoarse shout, he brings it down upon Axel's wrist. Castle-forged steel meets freshly grown skin, and the skin wins. Stannis' blade is stopped dead in its tracks by Axel's arm, traveling no further as the Lord of Storm's End is left wide-eyed and baffled by what he's seeing. Pulling his blade back, Stannis looks from it to Axel in disbelief. Axel just smiles, and then moves. He suspects he appears like a blur to Stannis' eyes, moving as fast as he can from one room to the other. He doesn't hold anything back. He doesn't slow himself down at all. For a moment, Stannis just stares blankly at where Axel once stood, confused. It's only when Axel clears his throat that his uncle whips around, eyes wide as he finds Axel on the other side of the room. Once he has Stannis' full attention again, Axel rears back a fist, and punches a hole in the wall beside him, going right through the stone and burying his arm up to the elbow in the castle wall. Stannis gapes, even as Axel slowly draws his arm back, shaking off dust and stone fragments and revealing a completely pristine, uninjured limb and fingers to his uncle's gaze. Then, he strides back over to Stannis at a more sedate, normal pace, standing before the older man once again. Forcing a jovialness he doesn't really feel onto his face, Axel shrugs. I know this is a lot. But this is who I am. This is what I'm capable of. When Stannis just continues to stare, Axel sighs and continues on, explaining how things are going to go to his new hand. I'll go to the Vale alone. I'm faster than any horse, so I'll go on foot. I imagine I'll be able to make it there and deal with things swiftly enough that I'll be back in King's Landing in time for Jon's funeral, even. Though really, I'll always be back in time for Jon's funeral because if you try to hold it without me present, I'll be very, very displeased. He tries to make his tone as amused and light as possible. It doesn't help all that much though, because, well, Stannis is still trying to catch up to everything that just happened. He can see the wheels turning in his uncle's mind as the older man tries to reconcile Axel's abilities with his understanding of the world, and fails. What are you? Maybe he should be insulted by the question, but he isn't, not really. After all, it's a question that Axel has asked himself for much of his life. Ever since he'd first realized just how different he was from everyone else. Ever since he'd begun to understand that normal people couldn't jump a 20-foot cliff face, or outrun a horse, or take a mountain warrior's mace to the face and have the mace be the thing to break apart. In the end, Axel lets out a slow breath, and shrugs again. I don't know. Jon knew what I could do. He counseled me to keep it a secret as best as I could so that they wouldn't label me a demon or monster. But he's gone now. And the Faith are praising my unnaturalness on every street corner in King's Landing. Stannis' eyes widen as a realization comes to him. You could have won the entire trial by the 7 all on your own. You were never in any real danger of losing, were you? Axel smiles fondly at that, his hand falling to the pommel of Stoneheart as he strokes the Valyrian steel sword affectionately. The blade had been the only other thing to survive the wildfire explosion. The handle and pommel had all but melted and fused with his hand after a certain point, forcing Axel to have those parts quickly replaced. But the Valyrian steel, his Stoneheart, that had remained intact. The only other survivor of the wildfire explosion. Not quite. It turned out Valyrian steel could cut me even if normal steel can't. Loras Tyrell actually came closer to killing me than the wildfire did, I think. Both had failed though, in the end. He'd survived Loras Tyrell and he'd survived the wildfire too. The entirety of King's Landing knows that I somehow healed from being doused in wildfire and burning for a week straight. Jon might have wanted me to keep hiding even after his death, but there's no point anymore. Westeros will soon know everything I can do and frankly, I'm done holding back. Stannis, Axel can see, is slowly coming around already. The man might be a little too rigid and inflexible at times, but he's had a while now to come to terms with Axel surviving the wildfire. In the face of that spectacle, the rest of what he's just been shown isn't really that bad, now is it? The Faith certainly won't repudiate you. It's like you said, they're already declaring you the Seven's blessed all across the city. Even if you show more of your capabilities, they'll continue to sing your praises so long as you continue to pay lip service to the Seven. Axel chuckles at Stannis' blunt appraisal. Nodding, he grunts. Perhaps the Seven did bless me. Who's to say? In the end, it doesn't really matter. Stannis gives him a questioning look at that, as if to say it very much does matter, but Axel waves him off. What matters now is avenging Jon and stopping Euron Greyjoy before he can do too much damage. Make sure Davos has the royal fleet ready to set sail soon after Jon's funeral. Make sure that the rest of the Seven Kingdoms are calling their banners and preparing to march for the Iron Islands. Smiling grimly, Axel lets out a sharp exhale. There will be no trial this time. We're going to smash the Ironborn fleet. I'm going to show them the error of their ways. And like I said, I will kill Euron Greyjoy with my bare hands if I have to. But first, Petyr Baelish and Lisa Arryn. I will have answers from them, I will have justice for Jon Arryn, and then I will return. Do I make myself clear? Letting out a shuddering breath, Stannis finally nods. Yes, Your Grace. It will be done. I will await your return. Good. Axel knows he's not making this easy on Stannis. There will probably be questions about where Axel has gone from just about everybody. His Kingsguard in particular aren't likely to be happy given the fervent loyalty they'd shown during his burning. Axel had taken the liberty of already letting Ser Aris know that he would be departing today. The Lord Commander was under the mistaken impression that he was taking members of the Kingsguard with him though, and Axel intended to be long gone by the time the man realized his mistake and that no one had left the city alongside him. In the end, he's already decided that he's not going to let anything or anyone slow him down. After Stannis departs, Axel doesn't hesitate. He puts on a cloak and departs from the Red Keep, moving through the city as fast as humanly possible, though not as fast as he could actually move. Eventually though, he's able to reach a section of the wall that he leaps over, not wanting anything to do with gate guards who might disrupt or stop him in order to find out his identity. Once he's outside of the city, Axel begins to truly move. It might be the first time in his entire life that he's actually ran as fast as he can for a prolonged period of time. While he'd gotten adept at traversing the mountains of the moon during his last few years in the Vale, there weren't any long stretches of flat ground there to run on. Not when it was just faster to leap and climb and jump over the rocky cliffs and whatnot to get where he needed to go. More than that though, Axel feels lighter in a way. Physically speaking anyways, because emotionally and mentally, he's never felt heavier. Still, as he runs north from King's Landing, the mountains of the moon looming far in the distance and impossible to miss, Axel is reminded of something he heard a maester once say. Fire was not only destructive. It was also cleansing in a way, with the ash left behind by flames usually turning out to enrich the soil and clear the way for new life to grow in its wake. Axel didn't think wildfire was necessarily supposed to be the same thing, and yet part of him wondered. He felt stronger and faster than ever before. And most of all, he feels light as a feather as he raced across the plains of the Crownlands on his way to the Vale. The only real issue is the Valyrian steel sword at his hip bouncing along his leg in an irritating fashion thanks to his speed. But then that's easy enough to fix by reaching down and pulling it off his belt, sheath and all. Gripping the sheathed blade tightly in his hand, Axel begins to pick up even more speed, flying across the ground so fast his feet don't always touch. With a grunt, he pushes himself off the ground on his next step, and goes flying, soaring through the air with his limbs pinwheeling for a moment before falling back down to earth. He lands heavy the first time, the ground beneath his feet giving way before him and causing him to dig a divot in the earth as he skids to a stop. But then he tries it again and soon enough he's able to find a rhythm of sorts. Leap, soar, land, run. Leap, soar, land, run. It's almost freeing in a way, to no longer hold himself back. To finally just be who and what he is. Maybe he is a monster. Maybe he is a demon. Maybe he truly is blessed by the Seven. At this point in time, Axel Baratheon knows just one thing and one thing only. His enemies are going to regret the day they decided to wage war on him and his. XXX. He's soarin', he's flyin'. Oops, wrong genre. Chapter 53. Lannisport. Time to check in on the Ironborn, and their victims. XXX. The last time the Iron Islands rebelled, Balon Greyjoy's opening move was the burning of the Lannister fleet. It was both a bold statement and solid tactics, all things considered. Lannisport was the closest major harbor to the Iron Islands after all, and while the Lannister fleet had never been the biggest in Westeros, it was certainly up there thanks to the leadership and forethought of Tywin Lannister. In the time since the Greyjoy Rebellion, however, House Lannister had rebuilt and could once again boast a fairly effective navy. They might not have the same numbers as the likes of the Ironborn, House Redwyn, or the Crown, but they were still up there. And really, fourth best wasn't the worst, unless one was up against one of the first three. Enemy ships on the horizon. Sir Kevin Lannister's jaw clenches as he stands on the walls of Lannisport, looking out across the harbor where Ironborn galleys were just becoming visible as small spots in the distance. Charged with the city's defense by the Lord of Castle Rock, his brother Tywin Lannister, Kevin can't help but worry about how this is going to go. Still, at least this time they had forewarning. After a moment to take a deep breath, he starts shouting orders and men begin scurrying about to make sure his orders all reach the right ears. The Lannister ships out in the harbor already have their own orders, of course. They know what they're in for, and every last cog, carrack, galley, and Drummond is crewed by brave men of the Westerlands ready to do their duty. No one quite knew why Euron Greyjoy hadn't launched a surprise attack this time around. Especially when the entire gambit had been orchestrated by Euron himself during the First Greyjoy Rebellion. Perhaps he knew the same trick wouldn't work twice. Perhaps he even knew that House Lannister had spies on the Iron Islands in place to alert them in advance and decided it was better not try. Or perhaps he had some other trick up his sleeve. Everyone knew the infamy of the Crow's Eye, after all. Euron Greyjoy, the Ironborn that all the other Ironborn detested so much he was exiled for it. They said he was the most comely and cunning of his brothers, despite the eye patch he wore over his left eye. However, they also said that his ship, the Silence, was crewed exclusively by mute thralls and mongrels whose tongues Euron tore out himself. Really, the problem Kevin had with the Crow's Eye's purported reputation was a simple one. If he was really as disliked and hated among the Ironborn as they all claimed, then how was he able to take control of them so damn fast? Balon's death and Euron's ascension, there simply hadn't been enough time between the two events, not really. It didn't make any sense, but it also wasn't Kevin's place to question such things in the end. His role, as always, was to follow his lord brother's commands, and Tywin had been quite clear about his priorities. Thanks to the overconfidence of the Crow's Eye, the Lannister fleet had been able to assemble in full ahead of time and was currently arrayed in Lannisport's harbor, ready to defend the port city with support from the walls. However, given the size of the Ironborn fleet, it was expected that House Lannister's fleet would once again be lost to the Savage Raiders, eventually. Kevin's job wasn't to keep the fleet intact forever, but to hold the city and to spend their fleet-like currency to do so. They were effectively taking up a defensive position until such time as House Redwyn could reinforce them from the south and the armies of the Westerlands could rally from further inland. On that front, the news from King's Landing had been conflicting. Some said that the king was dead. Some said his small council was slain by base treachery. Others still said that the king still lived but was grievously wounded. In the end though, House Lannister could rely on nobody but themselves for the time being. Still, Kevin thought that they had a pretty good chance of holding the city even if they eventually lost the fleet. Lannisport was surrounded by walls on all sides and was the largest settlement in the entirety of the Westerlands. Just breaking the Lannister fleet wouldn't be enough to give the Ironborn access. They would then have to scale the walls as well if they wanted to sack the city, something they hadn't even managed during Balon Greyjoy's rebellion. Yes, they'd burned the Lannister fleet while it was still anchored, but they hadn't quite managed to take the city back then. And Kevin would be damned if he was going to let them do so now. Sir. The Silence has been spotted. Euron Greyjoy is with this fleet. Kevin jolts at that, before moving to the man who spoke. Give me your fair eye. Why yes sir. Taking the fair eye from the scout, Kevin brings it to his face and squints as he peers through it. He'd never rightly understood how the Myrish lens worked. He just knew how to operate one, allowing him to peer across the massive distance separating him from the encroaching Ironborn fleet. There, at the head of the enemy armada, the Crow's Eye. Euron Greyjoy, self-proclaimed king of the Iron Islands, stands at the helm of his ship, the Silence. The man's eye patch makes him unmistakable, though the armor he wears seems to shimmer oddly through the fair eye in a way that Kevin can't explain. Behind the Silence comes more Ironborn ships, but not as many as Kevin was expecting. In fact, a quick count in his head and he's pretty sure the Lannister fleet actually outnumbers Euron Greyjoy's ships at the moment. Not by many, but certainly by enough for him to wonder what's going on. Where is the rest of the Ironborn fleet? Surely Euron wasn't so foolish that he was not only attacking a fully prepared Lannisport but also doing so with a fraction of his forces. That would be suicide. And yet, the more Kevin looks about, the more certain he becomes that there are no more ships on the horizon. Disbelief warring with duty, Kevin hesitates for a moment, but in the end, duty wins. Send messages to the captains immediately. Let them know that if the Ironborn fleet continues to approach, they should let them close in and encircle them so they can't escape. We will crush Euron Greyjoy between our ships and the walls and end this so-called war here and now. Yes sir Kevin. As his orders are sent out, Kevin scowls furiously, once again peering through the fair eye. It just didn't make any sense. And yet, over the next while, that's exactly what happens. The Ironborn fleet, much smaller than it should be, is led deeper and deeper into the harbor by Euron and his ship. Meanwhile, the Lannister fleet spreads out and moves to surround them, slowly but surely cutting off any possibility of escape. It's not long before the Ironborn are in a position where they will have to fight their way out if they want to retreat. More than likely, they'll just die. Could this really be happening? Could this farce of a war be about to end before it had even truly begun? And yet, Kevin sees no panic among the Ironborn ships. Not a single one of the notoriously independent reavers breaks away from the fleet to try and run. They all stay the course even as their capacity to retreat is closed to them. The enemy ships creep closer and closer to the city, until they're almost in range of the scorpions, archers and other siege equipment situated on Lannisport's walls. They stop just shy of that though, causing Kevin to furrow his brow and frown. Peering through the Myrish far eye, he can make out Euron Greyjoy at the helm of his ship far more clearly now. It's almost as if the man is looking right at him with his one visible eye, staring Kevin down from afar in a way that sends shivers down his spine. Signal the fleet to begin moving in. Tell them to push the Ironborn towards us so that we can begin firing upon them from the walls. Even as his orders are given, however, Kevin watches Euron Greyjoy bring a large, ornate horn to his lips. He watches the man blow it, and to his surprise, he even hears the horn clearly on the wind despite the sheer distance between the two of them. Kevin stiffens, watching carefully to see exactly what would happen next. Did the Ironborn have some secret weapon? Was the horn their signal to deploy it and begin their attack? He wets his lips, his tongue wavering in his mouth as he prepares to shout further orders, only, they never come. Slowly, the fair eye comes down from Sir Kevin Lannister's face as he finds that he's fully capable of watching what happens next without the aid of the Myrish contraption. At the blowing of Euron Greyjoy's horn, something shifts beneath the waves. A dark shadow that Kevin can only make out because the height of Lannisport's walls gives him bird's-eye view of the bay. Abruptly, massive appendages each the size of a galley themselves blast out of the water and come slamming down on Lannister ships on one side of the Ironborn fleet. Meanwhile, the Ironborn fleet immediately turn in the opposite direction, aiming for the other half of the split Lannister boats. All of a sudden, it's that half of the Lannister fleet that's outnumbered. It had seemed like perfect strategic sense in having the fleet encircle the Ironborn so they could assail them from all sides and cut off any chance of escape. However, that's now abruptly turned on its head as it's revealed that the Lannisters were the ones who had walked right into a trap. And Kevin just stands there, staring wide-eyed at the kraken that emerges from the depths of the harbor and begins to lay waste to the boats around it. Sure, everyone knew that the arms of House Greyjoy was that of a golden kraken on a black background. Stories of krakens bringing down ships were relatively commonplace, though most of the time it was lone ships and the krakens were often attracted by something else like excess blood in the water. This wasn't like those stories. And Kevin had never heard of a kraken of this size coming this close to land. It almost felt like the monster filled half of the harbor with its bulk under the waves. The Lannister fleet didn't stand a chance. Would the city? Kevin swallows thickly as he looks from the swinging appendages of the giant kraken to the walls of the city he'd been tasked with defending from the Ironborn menace. All of a sudden, he finds himself truly questioning for the first time whether or not he can actually hold the city. The walls of Lannisport go right up to the water, after all. In the end, all he can do is find his nerve and begin barking out further orders as the Lannister fleet is steadily sunk, again. Among those orders, he has word sent to his brother in Castle Rock as hastily as possible. Tywin needs to know what's happening here. If Lannisport falls, then his brother needs to be prepared for their house's ancestral seat to potentially come under siege. XXX. Euron Greyjoy watches with a faint smile on his lips as the Lannister fleet crumbles before him. It would have been nice to have more time, of course. But at this point, Euron was used to the failures of lesser men. First with Renly Baratheon, and now with Petyr Baelish. The deal he'd made with Renly had been a simple one, perhaps because he knew deep down inside that it wouldn't really pan out. In exchange for one of the Valyrian steel swords he'd collected from Valyria, Renly had promised to grant the Iron Islands their independence once Euron took control from his brother. If Renly had stayed true to his word, it would have been disastrous for the Baratheon king. Never mind that his claim to the throne would have already been tenuous at best. Winning the throne only to allow one of the seven kingdoms to secede would have brought him no end of trouble closer to home, and given Euron all the time he needed to prepare for war. Of course, Euron had no intentions of leaving one of his many trophies from Old Valyria in the other man's hands either way. Eventually, once the Iron Islands were properly under his control following a Kingsmoot, he would have declared war on Westeros and they would have swept across the continent like the whores of old. Eventually, Euron would have gotten the sword back, likely after taking the Iron Throne for good measure. In the end though, Renly had lost. As Euron suspected he might. The other man couldn't even turn the tide with a Valyrian steel sword of all things. His nephew had defeated his champions, taken the sword for himself, and exiled Renly to the Wall to join the Night's Watch. That in turn had led to the plan with the treacherous master of coin, Petyr Baelish. This time around though, it was the weasel of a man who had been the one to approach Euron. Together, they plotted and schemed to introduce uncertainty and chaos to the Seven Kingdoms. The original plan was for Baelish to poison Jon Arryn while Euron would make sure his older brother had his accident and a Kingsmoot could be called. They were to be one another's distractions, in the long term. But then Baelish was very nearly caught and like all weak men, he'd begun to panic. He'd changed their arrangement and forced Euron to move far sooner than he otherwise would have preferred to. Not just sooner, Euron had been forced to show his hand entirely. The kraken that even now savages Lannisport at his command was a weapon that Euron would have preferred to keep hidden until such a time as it was truly necessary. His control over it certainly made it all but impossible for any Ironborn to argue against his right to rule the Iron Islands, after all. Even his idiot brother Victarion had been unable to argue in the face of Euron standing framed by the giant sea monster behind him. But at the same time, revealing it as he'd had to meant that he could not save it for a later date. If only he'd been able to stick to the original plan of winning a Kingsmoot, he could have held the Kraken in reserve until it was most useful. No matter. The Crow's Eye knows what he must do. He knows exactly why he's here. Glancing down at his hand, he frowns as he sees it shaking for a moment. Clenching it into a fist calms it, and then he lifts that fist and points it towards the city in front of him. The Kraken twitches at the wordless command, still busy destroying the last of the Lannister fleet. However, as the sailors from those ships drown, the Kraken begin to move, pulling itself across the floor of the harbor on its many appendages, heading straight for the city walls. To their credit, the men on those walls don't hesitate. Scorpion bolts are fired, as are hundreds of arrows. They pepper Euron's beast, though most don't find purchase in its body. Reaching land, the Kraken raises an appendage, easily as big around as one of the walled city's towers, and brings it down on the ancient stonework, cracking through a section of the wall in one blow and a truly impressive display of strength. The shouts and screams of panicking men fill the air again and Euron's smile grows into something that's half snarl, half grin, even as he signals the rest of his fleet forward to begin taking the city. Baelish's last missive made it clear that he thought Axel Baratheon would die in his newest scheme, giving them both so much more chaos with which to execute their plans. But Euron knew better. Nothing that Baelish could do to that thing could actually succeed in killing it. Axel Baratheon would live, and they would face one another in battle soon enough. XXX. A.N.O. Now what does Euron think he knows about Axel? Chapter 54. The Bloody Gate. A.N. Axel arrives at the Bloody Gate. XXX. There was something to be said for physically exerting oneself. Axel could count the number of times he'd been out of breath in his life on one hand, really. Only two had taken place recently. First, there was his encounter with the Strangler in the Vale, the particularly virulent and fast-acting poison giving him a bit of trouble at first before he'd gotten used to it. And now there was his run from King's Landing all the way to the Bloody Gate in the Vale. Racing up the high road with his new method of bounding leaps had been particularly exhilarating, and for the first time in much too long, Axel had felt sweat beading on his brow. Of course, he slows down as he gets closer to the massive series of battlements that make up one of the most respectable fortifications in Westeros. And by the time the Bloody Gate comes into view, his breathing is already evened out and he's already stopped sweating. The last time he'd come through here, Axel had admittedly not been paying as much attention as he should have. Now, as he puts his sheathed sword back at his belt and approaches the Bloody Gate, he takes in the sights while his beating heart swiftly calms down. The Bloody Gate is dominated by two long parapets that are built into the stone cliffs of the Mountains of the Moon. The high road is watched over by twin towers joined by a completely covered bridge and grows so narrow here that less than 4 riders could pass side by side. The men stationed at the gate can fire through arrow slits from all 3 locations, be it the towers, the bridge, or the battlements. Axel remembers from his lessons in the Airy hearing that at least a dozen armies were slain during the Age of Heroes, trying and failing to take the fortifications. Meanwhile, during Aegon's conquest, the Targaryens bypassed the Bloody Gate entirely, with Visenya Targaryen personally flying her dragon Vhagar straight to the Airy in order to force House Arryn to bend the knee. Perhaps Axel could have and should have done the same. There was certainly nothing stopping him from scaling the mountains of the moon and appearing in the Airy without ever stepping foot through the Bloody Gate. However, while he was here for vengeance, he was also here as king of the Seven Kingdoms. And one question had plagued Axel's mind more than any other as he bounded across the land on his way here. Just how deep did the rot run? Even if he thought he would succeed in killing Axel along with his small council, Baelish choosing the Vale as his place of retreat told a story. A story of corruption, of deception, and of lies. Axel wanted to get to the bottom of things. He wanted to believe that it wasn't as bad as he feared. And finding out the truth started here, at the Bloody Gate. The title for the man in command of the Bloody Gate was Knight of the Gate, and that position had been held by Sir Brynden the Blackfish for over 2 decades. Sir Brynden Tully, uncle to Lysa Arryn, once Lysa Tully. Jaw set, eyes narrowed, Axel makes his way up towards the Bloody Gate, unsurprised when a voice calls out to stop him in his tracks. Hold. The Bloody Gate is closed by order of Lady Arryn. None may pass through. It's not Brynden Tully's voice. Perhaps the Blackfish is not in attendance. Tilting his head to the side, Axel's eyes flash as he considers the battlements for a heartbeat. He's not wearing his crown. From this distance, he probably doesn't look like much, nor would he be recognizable to normal human eyes. Finally, he calls out, his voice carrying through the air. For what purpose does Lady Arryn close the Bloody Gate? There's a pause and for a moment Axel wonders if he's going to even get an answer. But finally. They say the king is dead, and Lord Arryn with him. They say it was treachery most foul, more wildfire but this time purposeful. The Bloody Gate is to be locked down until further notice. You must turn around and leave. Interesting. So they didn't know he'd survived yet. Or more likely, didn't believe the tales of his survival. After all, if Petyr Baelish truly was behind the wildfire attack, which was looking very likely, then he would be more certain than anyone else that Axel couldn't have survived. Axel could have had ravens sent to the Vale to let them know he still lived, but that came back to the question of just how deep the rot extended. In the end, he'd chosen not to, coming here alone instead so he could find out just how many men had to die for Baelish's crimes. For a long moment, Axel considers announcing himself, but at this distance, he knows he won't be believed. Better to get closer first, even if by subterfuge, so that men who will recognize his face can vouch for his identity. I have no supplies with me. If I turn around now, I will surely die on my way down the high road. Allow me to share your table this evening, to fill my belly so that I might return to Derry in the morning. There's another pause at that, no doubt with them conferring among themselves. But the next time a voice sounds out, it's not the voice of the man who was speaking to Axel before. Instead, it's the more commanding, more familiar voice of Sir Brynden Tully, the Blackfish. I'm afraid that we cannot do that, good Sir. We have our orders from the Lady Regent of the Vale. None are allowed through the Bloody Gate. None are to be allowed to even approach the Bloody Gate. This is the Lady Regent's decree. Axel frowns, hearing a note of discontent in the Knight of the Gate's voice. Sir Brynden doesn't sound too happy about his orders, for all that he'll still obey. Still, is it possible that the Blackfish isn't actually involved in all of this? Of course, when he doesn't immediately turn and walk away, Sir Brynden's voice echoes out again. There are multiple archers trained on you at this point, good Sir. I suggest you leave with your life while you still can. Better to risk it on the high road than lose it with certainty here and now. Oh, now that pisses Axel off. Baring his teeth in a rictus of a grin, Axel shakes his head. The first man to fire an arrow at me loses a hand. Perhaps this would have been the time to announce himself. Perhaps he might have even been believed or at least gotten Sir Brynden's attention enough to see if the man was truly in on it or not. But Axel isn't feeling very logical. Nor is he feeling very merciful. When the first arrow flies out of an arrow slit a moment later, Axel reaches up and catches it, taking note of the distinctive fletching. Then, he tosses it aside and darts forward. More arrows swiftly follow the first one, but none of them so much as come close to hitting him, even if they would have just glanced off anyways. Axel is done playing around. He's not sure why he gave them a chance, honestly. Everyone who followed Petyr Baelish and Lysa Arryn would need to be purged. To that end, he crouches down, and leaps. Shouts of alarm and shock reach his ears as Axel soars through the air, one fist out in front of him and the other holding the pommel of Stoneheart steady at his side. A moment later and he slams into the covered stone bridge that arches over the mountain pass. Axel's fist and the stone of the bloody gate meet, and Axel's fist wins. He crashes right through into the covered bridge, landing on the wooden floor within, a snarl on his face. By the seven. How did he do that? Kill it. Kill it. Drawing Stoneheart in one smooth motion, Axel turns as the first man runs at him with a blade. He cuts them down before they can even swing at him, and then bats an arrow out of the air aimed for his head for good measure. Not that he really needed to, but it was like a gnat flying in his face, he moves on instinct. The rest of the men on the bridge look torn between charging him and fleeing in terror after seeing what he's capable of up close and personal. Axel just bares his teeth, not intending to let any of them get away. In the end, it doesn't matter because the doors at either end of the bridge that lead into the Bloody Gate's two towers burst open and more men in armor come filing in. There's suddenly no room for anyone already on the bridge to flee even if they wanted to, unless they wanted to throw themselves out of the hole Axel had made upon his entry. At the head of one of the groups is the Blackfish, a look of steely determination on his face as he holds his sword aloft. It's a good look. A courageous look. Of course, it only really lasts until Sir Brynden gets a look at Axel's features. Then, the determination melts away in an instant, replaced by astonishment as Brynden Tully's eyes widen in surprise, his jaw dropping open in shock. Immediately, the Knight of the Gate lifts up his hand. Hold. His men on both sides of Axel skid to a halt, showing their discipline even as their faces contort in confusion. Well, not all of them. As they finally get a good look at Axel's snarling features, he sees more than a few men begin to recognize him. He'd grown up in the Vale, after all, and a bit of stubble and mostly bald head isn't enough to hide his familiar features entirely. Axel himself is somewhat shocked when Sir Brynden Tully suddenly drops to a knee in front of him before shouting out a command to all other men in the vicinity. Kneel before the king. Kneel before Axel Baratheon, first of his name. As men drop to their knees all across the enclosed bridge, Axel frowns, his blood still pumping in his veins. Was that it? Really? Did this mean that the Blackfish wasn't part of the plot after all? Or was this some scheme to get him to drop his guard so they could try and kill him? In the end, it didn't really matter. None of them had the ability to end his life. The rage, the bloodlust, the anger, it had all come so quickly. But just as quickly, it flees as Axel looks to the man he'd already slain, the one who had come at him with a sword. He can't bring himself to regret the death right now. But he might come to in time if the man was truly innocent of any crime save for being in the wrong place. My king, forgive my men, they were only following my orders. We were told you were dead, and you did not announce yourself. Sir Brynden is careful to keep even the slightest note of reproach from his voice as he speaks, but Axel can tell that the man is displeased about the way things played out all the same. Scoffing, he just shakes his head as he pushes away any feelings of guilt. Would you have believed me? Besides, I knew not how deep the rot went. I still don't. The look on Brynden's face is one of pure confusion, but can Axel really trust it? Can he trust any of this? Blood drips from Stoneheart, which remains bared at his side, even as he sweeps his gaze across the kneeling men, just waiting for one of them to make a move. When none do and the silence stretches on for a moment too long, Axel lets out a sigh before huffing and waving his free hand through the air. Someone bring bread and salt. Like a man clutching onto any chance at life, the Blackfish's eyes light up and he quickly backs up Axel's command with one of his own. Do as the king says, immediately. The next few minutes are rather tense as someone scrambles to get the provisions. Guest right was an ancient, sacred law of hospitality. When invoked, neither the guest nor the host could harm the other for the length of the guest's stay. Of course, Axel would only consider such guest right to extend to his time at the Bloody Gate. He wouldn't let it stop him from doing what needed to be done up at the Eyrie. Still, when the bread and salt are finally provided and he partakes of both, he can see how the men around him all exhale in relief. Axel himself calms down further as well, cleaning Stoneheart and sheathing the Valyrian steel blade back at his side. This was, well, it wasn't perfect, but it went a long way to assuring him that Brynden Tully truly might not know what had happened or what sort of treachery he was being made party to. The Blackfish was an honorable man in truth and deed as well as reputation from the look of things, and so Axel reins in his temper, despite the ever-present urge to just slaughter everyone around him and continue onward to the Eyrie. He even wordlessly discards his earlier promise of cutting off a hand of the first archer to fire at him without comment. And that was after he'd already identified the man in question from the fletching on his arrows. Your Grace, what did you mean by rot? Why have you come here all alone? Eyes blazing, Axel stares Esser Brynden down. Justice, Esser Blackfish. I have come here to enact justice for the deaths of Lord Aron, Lord Varys, and Grandmaster Pycelle. Petter Baelish knows something about what happened in the small council chambers over a week ago. He fled the city by ship the very hour that the explosion went off, with your niece and her son at his side. The Knight of the Gate's eyes widen, even as whispers and mutters break out all around them. Once again, Axel sweeps his gaze back and forth, looking for any man who seems like he might be a co-conspirator. Surely Baelish wouldn't have come to the Vale if he didn't have his own spies embedded in the important places. Places like the Bloody Gate. There. Suddenly, Axel strides forward and points unerringly towards the back of the gathered men. That man. Do not let him leave. Fortunately, between Esser Brynden identifying him as king and his partaking in guest right, Axel has enough pull that the men all turn towards where he's pointing instantly. When the man he's pointing at jolts and tries to run, they all lunge forward and quickly wrestle him to the ground. Soon enough, the man is dragged before Axel and Esser Brynden, already blubbering and bawling as he begs for mercy. Stepping forward, the Blackfish backhands the man across the face, causing him to fall silent. Axel then drops into a crouch before him, looking into the trembling man's eyes. Speak. It weren't nothing bad, Grace. Lord Baelish just pays me for information. I was just going to send, a message, let him know you was coming. Please Grace. Mercy. Mercy. Axel grits his teeth and shakes his head as he rises to his feet with a disgusted huff. Upon seeing that he's not going to take matters into his own hands, Esser Brynden orders the man imprisoned in one of the Bloody Gate's cells before turning towards him. Axel speaks before the Blackfish can though. I'm heading onwards to the Eyrie to settle this once and for all. I can't say quite yet just how involved in all of this treason your niece is, Esser Brynden. If you wish to stay here at your post, I will not blame you. Brynden Tully blinks a few times before shaking his head. No, your Grace. You're right that we must get to the bottom of this immediately. If Lisa, no. I suspect to my dismay that she's at least partially involved in this. She's been infatuated with Littlefinger since they were children and he was fostered in Riverrun. All I can hope is that she's merely been led astray and doesn't know everything he's done, but either way, you have my sword, my king. Good. The Blackfish's presence at his side would give Axel added legitimacy, not that it really mattered. Everyone in the Eyrie knew who he was. And even if they all decided to side with Baelish and Lisa and attempted to kill him, they would fail. One way or another, this would end today. Then have your 2 fastest horses prepared. We will leave immediately. That seems to surprise Esser Brynden. Only the 2 of us, your Grace. Give me a bit more time and I can have us accompanied by more of my men. But Axel is shaking his head before Brynden is even done talking. No. I want to move fast. It'll either be us on horseback, or me alone. Do you think that man was the only one Littlefinger had on his payroll? He was probably just the most likely. I want to be at the Eyrie before Lord Baelish can hear of my arrival. Fortunately, the Blackfish really is the loyal sort. That look of steely determination appears in his eyes again as he nods sharply. As you say, my king. While Esser Brynden goes to get the horses, Axel spares one last glance towards the dead man who tried to attack him. Then, he leaves the bridge and heads back down to the ground, this time the normal way through one of the towers. It was far past time that Petter Baelish had his reckoning. XXX. Esser Brynden dodging bullets like Neo in this chapter. An inch away from getting him and every last one of his men killed by a slightly irrational and extremely furious Axel. Next time, Petter Baelish gets his comeuppance. Chapter 55. Moon Door. 2 things to note. 1. The moon door in this story is the TV show version where it's in the floor instead of the wall because I just like it better that way. 2. This chapter is over 4,400 words. Lock in. XXX. Petter does so love it when a plan comes together. Standing in the back of the Eyrie's main audience chamber known as the High Hall, he keeps himself somewhat unobtrusive and out of the way for the time being. All the while, Lisa is holding court as Lady Regent, sat upon her dearly departed husband's weirwood throne with her son sitting in her lap. Things are going swimmingly, really. The voyage to Gulltown had been thoroughly uneventful and so had the quick trip from Gulltown up to the Eyrie. By the time they'd arrived in heart of the Vale, News of the wildfire explosion in King's Landing had reached their ears as well, giving Lisa all the reason in the world to seize control and lock down the Vale as Lady Regent until her son came of age. Between his resources and her claim, they would make swift headway in making sure that every lord in the Vale was loyal to them and them alone. And with Lisa's son being so young, they would have free run of the place, just so long as they kept things under control. On top of that, Euron had come through as well, thankfully. His declaration of war upon the Seven Kingdoms had added to the flames of chaos spreading across the continent in a big way. Everyone would be looking towards the west and the Ironborn now, and nobody would question Petter taking control in the east. It was all just so perfect. Well, as perfect as one could hope for, at least. Mama. I wanna see people fly some more. Not now, my sweet Robin. Right now we're enjoying the jugglers. No. I want them to fly. As Lisa handles her fussy son, Petter rolls his eyes from where he's off to the side of the throne and out of sight. Fortunately, most of the court doesn't hear the interaction between the Lady Regent and her son. Those that do look distinctly discomfited, as well as they should. Robert Arryn, the only offspring and thus heir of Jon and Lisa Arryn, is a halfwit. His intelligence truly leaves something to be desired, and it seems he's developed a taste for sadism as well after they had to send a few disloyal undesirables through the moon door these past few days. It's fine though. Lisa should be able to control Robert for the time being at least. And in another week or so it won't seem so unnatural or strange when she names Petter as Lord Regent of the Vale until her son comes of age. At which point, sweet Robin, can be put out of sight and out of mind and Petter will be able to rule the Vale as he sees fit. All while Stannis Baratheon and the rest of Westeros are too busy dealing with Euron Greyjoy's insurrection to do anything about it. Of course, from what Petter knows, they won't have nearly as easy a time putting down the Ironborn rebellion this go around. Not when the new King of the Iron Islands commanded a massive kraken bigger than several galleys put together. Fortunately, Petter didn't have to worry about that sort of thing. Krakens couldn't exactly get up here to the mountains of the moon, and even if Euron succeeded at conquering the rest of Westeros, the Bloody Gate would hold against any army that the Ironborn could muster up, as it had for thousands of years. Not that Petter though the Oneid Ironborn would get that far. He might conquer the Westerlands and Riverlands though, and wouldn't that just be wonderful? The chaos of a fractured Seven Kingdoms combined with the inflexibility of a king like Stannis Baratheon sitting upon the Iron Throne promised to be absolutely delightful. It would also give Petter all the room he needed to maneuver his way to greater and greater heights. There were some strange rumors out of King's Landing claiming that Axel Baratheon had survived, but Petter had ruled them out as little more than tall tales likely generated by the faith to try to cover up the loss of two kings in such a short amount of time. There was simply no way that Axel Baratheon could possibly have survived that wildfire explosion, after all. Petri had planned everything perfectly. The doors to the high hall open up all of the sudden and Petter blinks as a voice echoes out. Announcing Sir Brynden Tully the Blackfish, Knight of the Gate, and guest. What? Petter's brow furrows as the herald looks slightly confused by his own words at the end there. The entire court goes silent as Sir Brynden strides in with his hand on his sword pommel. The jugglers who had been putting on a show mere moments before immediately stop and move to the side, sensing the change in atmosphere that comes over the room. Petter's confusion mounts as he wonders what could possibly make the Blackfish leave his post as commander of the Bloody Gate. His eyes fall upon the man coming up behind him, wearing a hooded cloak and holding his own sword sheathed at his side. Lisa sets a fussy Robert aside and rises from her dead husband's weirwood throne, her own face twisted in baffled shock that slowly morphs into a growing scowl. Uncle, what are you doing here? For what reason have you abandoned your duty at the Bloody Gate? Coming to a stop on the other side of the moon door, opposite of Lisa, Brendan's face is set in a deep, deep frown, his eyes dark and stormy. Treason, niece. I am here because of treason most foul. Something ugly begins to form in Petter's chest. Perhaps because his first instinct is to fear that Brynden Tully has somehow found out about their schemes. The Blackfish is honorable to a fault. If he knew everything that they'd done, or even half of the things Petter had convinced Lisa to do, then he would be very, very unhappy. But surely that wasn't it, right? There was no way. He'd covered his tracks. He'd made certain that. The hooded man next to Sir Brynden Tully chooses that moment to throw back his hood and reveal his features. Shock ripples through the room as most of the Ares court immediately recognizes the face of Axel Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Seven Kingdoms. After all, many of them had watched him grow up right here in the area as Axel Stone, bastard of the Vale. Lisa's face goes deathly white as the blood drains from her features. Her eyes widen and she raises a shaky hand to point at Axel. No, that's not possible, you're supposed to be dead. Oh no. Petter resists the urge to cover his face with his hand, even as he steps further away from the dais upon which the weirwood throne sits. He needed to get out of here. This wasn't going to go well. Not at all. Axel proves it as he steps forward, eyes narrowed and head held high. Is that so, Lisa Aron? Am I supposed to be dead? Perhaps by your hand, or perhaps by the hand of your accomplice, Petter Baelish. Petter freezes as the mere mention of his name causes eyes to search him out and lock on once they find him. Among them are Lisa's eyes as the foolish, dim-witted bitch actually has the audacity to seek him out and look to him for help and advice in this moment. Forcing a smile onto his face even as his mind races with a million plans, Petter Baelish steps forward into full view and bows low at the waist. Your Grace, I don't know what you're talking about, but I remain your ever loyal, ever faithful servant. I am so very glad to see the reports of your death were greatly exaggerated. Just as I was deeply saddened to hear about the loss of my peers and Lord Aron. As he's speaking, his eyes dart around the room, looking for anything that might help him escape a truly ignoble fate. Then, his gaze lands upon a certain man who had wound up stuck in the area when Petter and Lisa had shut down the bloody gate. That might be a possibility if nothing else worked. Meanwhile, Axel Baratheon scoffs. Oh, are you now? And I'm sure you have a litany of excuses for why you weren't in the small council chambers that day when the explosion happened. The judgment in the room is quickly growing as every word the young king speaks turns the Vale's court against him and Lisa. Of course, Lisa isn't exactly helping, the dumb bitch. Petter had nothing to do with the blast. He had permission from my husband to escort my son and I to the Vale. It was all perfectly legal and we have the documents to prove it. No, Lisa, you fool. Ah yes. Documents that were found in the Tower of the Hand as well. For a moment, Lisa's eyes blaze with vindication. Until the king continues on, of course. Documents that were deemed fraudulent with my hand's signature and seal forged by another. Blinking rapidly, Lisa shakes her head. No. That's not true, you're lying. Murmurs immediately break out as the foolish woman calls the king of the Seven Kingdoms a liar. Even if Axel was lying, he's not, the man is the fucking king. Petter lets out a short sigh, even as Axel Baratheon ignores Lisa for a moment to look around the room. Where is High Steward Nestor Royce? Unfortunately, Lisa is too eager to answer that as well. He's in the sky cells. He dared to question my rule. He's lucky that he was not sent through the moon door for his treason. Silence falls over the high hall. Nobody says a word as the temperature in the audience chamber seems to drop by several degrees. An errant shiver runs down Petter's spine, even as Axel Baratheon stares at Lisa for several long moments before finally turning to Esser Brynden. Retrieve Lord Royce from the sky cells immediately. As you say, Your Grace. Lisa, of course, squawks indignantly at this. What? Don't be ridiculous. Uncle, stay right where you are. I am the Lady Regent of the Vale. This man is clearly a pretender. He can't be the king. The king is dead, killed by wildfire. My uncle has taken leave of his senses. Guards, take them both into custody. Petter is starting to realize he's made a mistake. He's starting to fully comprehend the stupidity inherent in coming here to the Vale after departing from King's Landing. It really had seemed like the best option at the time. If all went to plan, it would have been. But things had not gone to plan. And now he found himself not in the heart of his power, as it could have been with a year or two and a million golden dragons, but rather, surrounded by men and women that Axel Baratheon had grown up with. Men and women who would never in a million years believe he was a pretender. In fact, this was the one place in the entire world where declaring Axel Baratheon a pretender was never going to work. Everyone in this room knew who he was. Enough recognized him by sight that trying to claim he was anything except for who he was utter foolishness. None of the guards or knights in the room move at Lisa's commands. Not a single one of them does a thing as she shouts in a panic, horror writ large across her face. Meanwhile, Esser Brynden departs and mere minutes later comes back with a somewhat haggard Nestor Royce in tow. The king immediately goes to him, one hand on the back of the High Steward's neck, their foreheads touching. Petter can't quite make out the words they say to one another, even as they speak in quiet tones. Finally, Axel pulls away and looks back to Lisa. No, not to Lisa, to Robert Aron, sat upon the weirwood throne. Is he truly Jon's son? The words are directed towards Lord Royce, obviously. But Lisa has never been very good at picking up on things like that. Unfortunately, she's just good enough at reading a room to realize when she's lost apparently. Because. Of course he's his son. Weak, sickly, pathetic. He embodies my old, decrepit husband's worst qualities to a T. If only he had been Petter's. If only he had come from the loins of a stronger, better man. The temperature of the audience chamber drops even lower as Axel Baratheon stalks around the circumference of the moon door, his eyes never once leaving Lisa. Jon Arryn was the best of us. Are you admitting to making a cuckold of him? Smiling vindictively, Lisa sneers at him. I did. And I'd do it again. He was old and impotent even when my father married me off to him. All I ever was to him was a trophy, something pretty to look at. Petter saw me as something more. He saw my true value. He was 10 times the man that my pathetic, Lord husband, ever was. And with that, she's sealed both of their fates. Petter watches as Axel Baratheon seems on the verge of lunging at Lisa for a moment, before mastering his rage. Sir Blackfish. Remove Jon's son from the room. Take Robert Arryn to his chambers. Oh no. Even Lisa understands what that means, though only after Brynden Tully starts moving, of course. Her eyes widen in shock and then fear as she looks around the room and begins to realize just how deep the shit that they're in truly is. When her uncle comes up the dais to grab a whiny Robert Arryn, Lisa reaches for them both. NNO. Wait. MMY son, Mama didn't mean what she said, uncle. Don't leave me. Don't let them have me. But Sir Brynden will not look his niece in the eye. Even her son turns his face away from her and into his uncle's shoulder, apparently having just enough awareness to have understood what she'd said about him was an insult. The Blackfish carries young Robert out of the room and doesn't look back a single time, even as Lisa wails. The moment they're gone, the king moves. His face is stone as he grabs Lisa Arryn by the hair, making her cry out in pain. Nobody tries to stop him, not even Petter, as he drags her to the center of the room. The moon door cycles open as Lisa screams. No. Why you can't? I'm the Lady of the Vale. I'm Lady Regent until my son comes of age. You can't do this to me. Petter. Petter tell him he can't do this to me. But Petter stays silent. And Axel Baratheon doesn't so much as say another word. He just does it, thrusting Lisa Arryn out over the 600-foot drop. She's gone in an instant, her screams disappearing into the distance and cutting off almost immediately. The high hall falls silent as Axel Baratheon turns to face Petter next. And Petter plays his last card, smiling thinly. I would ask for a trial by combat, your grace. That causes the king to pause. He stills for a moment before tilting his head to the side. Oh. Still smiling, Petter Baelish nods. The late Lady Arryn's claims were untrue. I am innocent of the crimes she would lay at my feet. I demand a trial by combat so that the 7 who are one might reveal the truth of these matters to all assembled here. Time stretches on as Axel considers him like one might consider a bug. Petter resists the urge to shiver, doing his best to project the facade of an innocent man to everyone around them. Even if not a single one of them believes him to be blameless, it doesn't matter. In the end, the young king cannot deny his request, not when he's tied so much of his influence and reputation to the faith of the 7. Very well. Will you need a blade? Or do you hope to name a champion? Turning his smile apologetic, Petter spreads his hands wide. I'm afraid I've never been much of a swordsman. I would ask any man in this chamber who carries a blade to step forward and proclaim themselves my champion. I can guarantee whoever does so will have an eternal and valuable friend in me if they can prove my innocence. He puts as much emphasis on the words, eternal, and valuable, as he can. He can't exactly come out and say something like he'd pay 1,000,000 dragons for a champion, though he definitely would at this point. Still, speaking such words in public would damage his cause massively. In the end, he just has to hope that this is enough to. Alright, I'll be your champion. And there it is. Petter lets his smile widen a fair bit as the sellsword Bronn steps out of the crowd, causing a great deal of whispers to break out from those watching. Gloved hand on the pommel of his sword, the mercenary looks between Petter and Axel briefly, working his jaw for a moment. Axel, meanwhile, simply turns to Bronn with a strange smile on his face. Are you sure about that? There are better ways to die. Bronn snorts derisively and sketches a quick bow. But not better ways to make some coin, your grace. Unless you want to offer me gold to side with you instead. Petter winces as his champion makes his reasons for stepping forward far too clear. But then, what could he expect? Indiscretion was paid for, and Bronn hadn't been put on his payroll just yet. Petter had always intended to bring the skilled man over to his side with a generous helping of gold eventually, of course. However, he'd been holding off until Bronn was a bit more desperate due to the lockdown Lisa had instituted. He'd thought he had more time. Nestor Royce bristles at Bronn's irreverent tone, but Axel holds up a hand to keep the older man back. No. No gold. All I can offer you is your life. Only your life, sellsword. Bronn straightens up, a glint entering his eyes as he regards Axel in silence. For a moment Petter thinks that the man might actually back down and leave him to his fate. But in the end, he shakes his head and draws his sword. Ready when you are, your grace. Axel doesn't hesitate. He draws the Valyrian steel sword he won from the trial by the Seven, the one he'd named Stoneheart, and begins to advance right then and there. Bronn immediately backs away to put more room between them, holding his sword in one hand and pulling a long dagger from his side with the other. The king runs Bronn down like a charging bull, and Bronn takes advantage, half deflecting, half dodging the first blow with his longsword, while stabbing forward into Axel's side with the dirk. In that instant, Petter dares to hope that it's over and Bronn has won. Not that it will solve everything, but it would certainly give Petter a chance to escape the proverbial noose currently around his neck. Only, Axel doesn't go down. Bronn must have missed or something, and the next thing Petter knows, that blasted Valyrian steel flashes out quicker than he can follow and Bronn's head rolls from his shoulders. As the decapitated mercenary's body drops to its knees and then slumps to the floor dead, Axel spits on his corpse and sheathes his sword, before turning to Baelish, nothing but righteous fury in his eyes. Wait, your grace, surely WWE can talk about this. I am much more useful to you alive than dead. As Axel advances on him, he adopts a mirthless smirk and tilts his head to the side. Are you? You've done quite a lot of damage to my realm alive, Littlefinger. I can't imagine things will get any worse once you're dead and gone. Panic seizes upon his throat as Petter swallows hard, scrambling for anything he can use to save his own skin. Ooh, but they will. I can tell you things. I can tell you all about Euron Greyjoy. Did you know he was the one who gave Renly Baratheon that sword you wield now? All those moons ago, it was that man who tried to put his finger on the scale of your trial. Stopping right in front of him, Axel raises a single brow. And he's been planning to fight you all this time. He's ready for you, your grace. I can tell you his plans. I can tell you everything he might do. For a long moment, the young king seems to consider Petter's offer. Then, he shakes his head. No. With that, he grabs Petter by the front of his tunic and begins dragging him towards the moon door. Petter struggles, of course, but Axel's grip is like iron. He can't escape. Wait, what about the gold? All of the gold. Stopping at the edge of the moon door, holding them both so close that Petter's foot scrapes against the edge, Axel smiles grimly. The gold you stole from the royal coffers, you mean? The gold you pilfered over the years as my father distracted Jon with his ridiculous antics and terrible ruling. That gold. Nodding emphatically, Petter licks his lips as he shakes in Axel's grasp. Why yes. Yes, I have millions of golden dragons squirreled away. Kill me and they'll be lost forever. Let me live and I can get them for you. I can return everything in exchange for a modest sum and exile to Essos. You just have to let me live. He's lying, of course. He's not nearly that liquid. But he just needs a chance. Petter's eyes flick to the side and he immediately regrets it, looking down out the moon door to the empty air beneath the high hall. 600 feet. That was how far Lisa had just fallen. It was how far he would fall too, if he couldn't convince Axel to spare him. But the gold would get him right. Petter was sure of it. That was Axel Baratheon's main drive these past few months, aside from picking a queen. He'd had Jon and Petter working themselves to the bone to try and figure out how to get the royal debt squared away so that it wouldn't burden Axel's eventual children. I will always love the man, but Jon was a fool for trusting you. Forcing a smile onto his face, Petter shakes his head. No, your grace. Jon Arryn was a very smart man, I'm just smarter. I've always been clever. Always been good with numbers. Let me turn my talents towards helping you settle the realm's debts. I'll show you just how useful I can be. He's sure he's getting somewhere now. Axel must be feeling conflicted. He can't just kill Petter, or all his knowledge will die with. No. What? But don't worry. I'll come with you. To make sure. What? And then, before Petter can say anything else, Axel Baratheon jumps, and he takes Petter with him. Petter Baelish screams all the way down as the wind rips at his clothes and shreds his flesh. All the while, Axel stares at him with a stone-like face, silent as the grave until they finally hit and everything becomes so much more painful before it all goes black. XXX. Nestor Royce finds himself in a state of shock along with everyone else in the high hall as they all stare open-mouthed at the open moon door that their king just jumped through. The high steward's hand is outstretched, an aborted, no. On his lips that turns into a choked whimper instead. Why? Why would Axel jump too? Did he blame himself for Lord Aaron's death that much? Did he have nothing to live for anymore? Did he? And then, to the shock of everyone, a set of fingers suddenly grasps the edge of the moon door. And a moment later, Axel Baratheon pulls himself back up out of the hole, rising to his feet. He's covered in blood and viscera, but Nestor can tell it's not his own. There's not a hint of injury anywhere on the young king's person. Closing the moon door, Axel looks over at Nestor and smiles both apologetically and grimly. Sorry. But I had to make sure. Had to make sure. Nestor blinks rapidly, trying and failing to truly understand what just happened. Finally, Axel turns to the rest of the room, his eyes moving over them all in silent judgment for a moment. High Steward Nestor Royce is hereby named Lord Regent of the Vale until Robert Arryn, son and heir of Lord John Arryn, either comes of age or expires from his sickly nature. You will all treat the Lord Regent's words as if they were my own. Do not make me come back here anytime soon. Nestor just stares, not entirely sure what to make of everything that just happened. Around that time, Sir Brynden returns to the room, his face a little pale from the sight of Axel covered in blood, the dead sellsword on the floor and the complete absence of his niece or Lord Baelish. If Axel feels any pity for the Blackfish though, he doesn't show it as he nods sharply to both of them. Lord Regent. Sir Blackfish. Walk with me. And so they do, for what other choice do they have? He is the king, after all. XXX. I know some of you wanted Petter to die much slower and more painfully, but the moment that he and Lisa fled to the Eyrie, the only way for them to go out had to be the moon door. Meanwhile Axel is starting to become a bit of a cryptid, isn't he? Reminder. You can find the full 122 chapters of this story under the title The Unyielding Stag written by me on questionablequesting.com, hntai foundry.com, archiveofourown.com, and scribblehub.com.